Guns. Holloway, you're dead. 4 words. That's all it took to end everything she thought she knew. But the real ambush wasn't in the sky. It was waiting in a beige office, behind a name written in her dead father's handwriting, underlined so hard it tore the page. Draven says hold. Draven wrong. She'd carried that fragment for 12 years without a face to put it to. Now the face was standing in front of her, teaching her tactics, grading her every move and flinching every time her father's name came up. "Were you my father's flight lead?" she finally asked. The day of the accident. Something in his face didn't just crack. It broke. "Yes," he whispered. What he confessed next would rewrite everything she believed about the man she lost, and force her to decide, destroy the officer who buried the truth, or become the pilot her father always was. Stay till the end. The whiteboard moment will leave you speechless. Fictional story. All characters, units, locations, and events depicted are invented for entertainment purposes and do not represent real persons, military units, or historical operations. The quiet one they called Whisper. Part 1. The gate guard barely looked, just glanced at her ID, then at her face, then back down at the clipboard like she wasn't even worth the extra half second it would have cost him to actually see her. Ren Holloway didn't say anything. Didn't expect him to. She'd been driving since 4 that morning. Coffee gone cold in the cup holder hours ago. The cup itself sweating a ring onto the cracked vinyl of the dash. Windows down through the flat brown stretch of Central California because the air conditioning in her second-hand truck had given up somewhere outside Barstow and never came back, not even for a minute. Not even when she'd pulled over and hit the dash twice with the flat of her hand, the way her Uncle Ray always did to machinery that had stopped listening to him. It hadn't worked for Ray either, most of the time. Machines didn't care how much history you had with them. Cedar Hollow, Montana, was 1,400 miles behind her now. Somewhere back there, past 3 state lines and one very long stretch of Nevada desert that seemed to go on longer than the drive itself, was a kitchen table with a scorch mark from a coffee pot nobody had ever bothered sanding out, a mother who hugged too hard and let go too fast, and a gravel road that turned to washboard the last half mile before the house. Ahead of her now, a gate, a guard shack, a sign that said Naval Air Station Whitfield, point in block letters bleached pale by 20 years of desert sun, the paint peeling at the corners in long thin curls like old skin. She pulled through when the guard waved her on, unhurried. Didn't rush, didn't hesitate either. Because that was the thing about Ren. She never did either one. She'd learned a long time ago that both rushing and hesitating told a room something about you before you'd said a single word, and she preferred rooms to learn things about her slowly, on her own schedule, if they learned anything at all. The road inside the gate ran straight for almost a mile before it split, flanked on either side by sun-bleached grass and chain-link fencing that seemed less like security and more like habit, the kind of thing installed decades ago and never quite worth the paperwork to take down. Beyond the fence line, far off, she could see the flight line shimmering in morning heat that hadn't even peaked yet. Aircraft parked in neat gray rows, wings folded, waiting. Something in her chest tightened at the sight of them. Not fear. The opposite of fear, same as it had always been. She found the housing office, filled out paperwork with the same flat, careful hand she used for everything, and was directed to a barracks, building 2 streets back from the flight line. Brick the color of old rust. 3 stories. A laundry room on the ground floor with a sign taped to the door that said, out of order in handwriting, that looked like it had been there since before she was born. The room they gave her smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, and somebody else's cologne, 3 tenants removed. The scent baked so deep into the walls, it had probably survived a full repaint at some point. She set her sea bag down at the foot of the bed. 1 bag. That was all she'd brought. Everything else that mattered to her fit inside a shoebox wrapped in an old flannel shirt, tucked into the bottom of that bag like it might break if it got jostled too hard on the highway. It might. She didn't unpack right away. Just sat on the edge of the bare mattress for a minute, hands on her knees, breathing in the strange, stale air of a room that had held a dozen strangers before her. and would hold a dozen more after she left it, until the sound outside the window pulled her back. Jets. Somewhere off, past the flight line, a pair of Hornets went up in formation, the roar rattling the window glass in its aluminum frame. A low physical thrum she felt in her sternum before she consciously registered it as sound. She didn't flinch. She never flinched at that sound. Hadn't since she was 8 years old, strapped into a jump seat over a Montana wheat field, with wind screaming past a cracked window, and her Uncle Ray laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. Both of them small and loud and alive above 10,000 acres of gold. That sound had never scared her. What scared her, what had always scared her, if she was honest with herself, which she tried to be, even when it cost something, was rooms full of people. Rooms like the one she was about to walk into. Rooms where everyone already knew each other and she was the new variable nobody had asked for. She unpacked slowly. Uniform items first, hung with military precision, though nobody was watching to grade her for it. Boots lined beneath the closet. A single framed photograph, her mother, her father, herself at 6 years old, squinting into Montana's sun, set on the small government-issue dresser, angled just slightly, so it wasn't the first thing a roommate would see walking in, but close enough that Wren herself could see it from the bed. At the very bottom of the bag, last, the shoebox. She didn't open it. Not yet. Just set it on the closet shelf, pushed back behind a stack of folded t-shirts, the way you'd hide something, not because you were ashamed of it, but because some things needed walls around them to survive being carried at all. Then she changed into her flight suit, checked her reflection in the narrow mirror, bolted to the back of the door, not out of vanity, just out of the same thoroughness she brought to everything, the same instinct that made her check a pre-flight twice, even when the first check had been clean and headed for the ready room. Strike Fighter Squadron 14. Ironclad Squadron, they called themselves, and somebody had painted the name across a plank of scavenged plywood nailed above the ready room door, like it needed announcing to anyone who might have wandered in by accident. She stood outside that door for exactly 4 seconds longer than she needed to. 4 seconds. She'd counted them before, plenty of times, walking into plenty of rooms. It wasn't nerves, not exactly. It was more like the pause before a dive off a dock into cold water. The moment where your body understands what's about to happen a half second before your mind fully commits to it. Then she went in. The room was loud before she even got the door open. Loud in that particular way rooms get when the people inside already know each other, already trust each other, already decided, without ever having to say so out loud, who belongs and who's still auditioning. Nobody stood up. A couple of heads turned. One guy near the coffee pot gave her the quick up-down. The kind of look that isn't rude exactly, just assessing, cataloging, filing her somewhere in the back of his mind between other new arrivals he'd already half forgotten. Then he went right back to his conversation like she'd already been processed and dismissed in the same glance. She found an empty chair in the back row, sat, set her folder on her knees and waited. Because that was another thing about Wren. She'd learned a long time ago that waiting cost nothing. Waiting was free. You could wait forever, and nobody could take that from you, not the way they could take other things if you handed them over too early. Confidence. Trust. The soft parts of yourself that hadn't earned armor yet. The room filled in slowly around her. Flight suits in various states of wear, patches sewn on at odd angles, coffee mugs with unit crests half worn off from years of washing. Somebody had a radio playing low from a desk in the corner, country music barely audible under the general noise of a dozen conversations happening at once. She recognized none of the faces, expected to recognize none of them. That wasn't the part that made her chest feel tight. The part that made her chest feel tight was knowing that by the end of the week, every single person in this room would have decided something about her, and there was nothing she could do to control what that something would be. Lieutenant Commander Ellis Corrigan ran the front of the room with the kind of ease that only comes from a decade of never seriously doubting himself in a cockpit. Salt in his hair, more of it than there'd been in whatever photo hung in his old flight school yearbook, a voice like gravel under boots, The kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry. He checked her name against a roster clipped to a board, running one finger down the column of names with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this exact motion hundreds of times before and would do it hundreds of times again. Holloway. Not a question, just confirmation. He didn't look up from the clipboard while he said it. Workup starts Thursday. Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, and try not to embarrass anybody. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't warm either. It was nothing. And nothing, she was learning all over again in a new room, with a new set of faces, was worse than cruel, in its own particular way, because cruel, at least, meant somebody had noticed you enough to aim. Yes, sir, she said. That was that. Corrigan moved on to the next item on his clipboard, some scheduling issue involving a maintenance delay, and Wren went back to being furniture in the back row. The loudest voice in the room belonged to Lieutenant Grant Boyle. Call sign Anvil. 4 years in Hornets, 1 deployment behind him, and a swagger that walked into a room a full 2 seconds before the rest of him arrived. The kind of confidence that filled space, the way water fills a container, expanding to take up every bit of room it was given. He was telling a story to 3 other pilots near the front, something about a low-level run that had apparently gone sideways in a way that made everyone laugh, his hands moving through the air to illustrate whatever maneuver he was describing, his voice pitched just loud enough to make sure the whole room could hear it whether they wanted to or not. Beside him sat Lieutenant Priya Osei. Call sign Riddle, sharp-eyed, quiet in her own way, the kind of quiet that watched everything and said nothing until it mattered, her expression somewhere between amused and unreadable while Boyle talked. Near the front, arms crossed, sat Lieutenant Commander Marcus Teague, call sign Stonewall, senior enough in that room that he didn't have to prove a thing to anybody anymore, and everybody knew it, and he knew they knew it, and there was something almost peaceful about the way he sat, a man who had already fought whatever battles this room still had ahead of it for its younger members. Wren catalogued them the way she catalogued everything, quietly, thoroughly, filing each face and name and posture somewhere she could pull it back up later when it mattered. She had no call sign. New pilots didn't get one. Not until the squadron decided you'd earned it, watched you long enough to know what fit. Until then, you were just a last name. Spoken flat, spoken like it cost something to say, like the room was rationing its own effort. She ate lunch alone the first week. The chow hall was loud and bright and full of people who all seemed to already have somewhere to sit, some group they belonged to, and Wren took her tray to the end of a long table nobody else had claimed and ate quickly, methodically, the way she did most things that didn't require her full attention. She answered when spoken to, said nothing more than the question strictly required, and not one syllable more. Some people thought she was overwhelmed. She could see it in the way a couple of the junior officers looked at her. A kind of soft pity that assumed quiet meant struggling, that assumed a person who didn't fill silence with words must not have much to fill it with. Boyle decided something different. Decided she was out of her depth, plain and simple, and being the kind of man who rarely kept an opinion to himself for longer than it took to form it, he said so, out loud, on a Wednesday, in front of 8 people who'd all stopped talking to listen the moment his voice changed pitch, the way people always stop to listen when they sense a joke is coming at someone else's expense. Holloway. He grinned around the word like it tasted good. You sure they didn't misfile your paperwork somewhere? 'Cause you got real library energy. No offense. A couple of laughs. Quick, ugly little things, gone as fast as they came. The kind of laugh that exists mostly to confirm the joke landed rather than because anyone found it especially funny. Riddle didn't laugh, but didn't say anything either. Just watched, the way she watched everything, filing it away for reasons of her own. Wren closed her folder. Let the silence answer for her. Because silence, she'd learned over 25 years of practice, could say things words never quite managed to. Silence didn't apologize for itself, didn't explain, didn't hand anyone the satisfaction of watching it land. It simply existed, flat and unbothered, and left the room to decide what to do with the space it left behind. Corrigan was over by the coffee machine. Heard the whole thing, his expression not changing at all, though something in the set of his jaw suggested he'd heard it and hadn't liked it. Filed it away. Not yet, though. Not yet. Some things a commander let sit until they were ready to matter. Nobody in that room knew where Wren had come from, because she'd never once volunteered it. Not out of secrecy exactly. More out of a lifelong habit of understanding that most people didn't actually want the whole story when they asked where you were from. They wanted a two-word answer that let them file you somewhere convenient and move on to the next thing. Cedar Hollow sat 2 hours from anything that could be called a city, out where the wheat ran flat to the horizon, and the sky did more work than the land did. An enormous pale dome that seemed to stretch a person's whole understanding of scale the moment they were old enough to look up and really see it. Her Uncle Ray flew crop-dusting runs for half the county, an old yellow air tractor patched together with parts and stubbornness, and a working knowledge of engines that had been passed down from his own father. And he'd taken her up, the first time at 8 years old, jammed into a jump seat built for someone twice her size, her small hands gripping a metal bar bolted to the frame, because there wasn't anything else to hold on to. Something in her had gone still that day. Not fear. The opposite of fear. A kind of stillness that felt, even at 8, like arriving somewhere she'd always been meant to be, though she wouldn't have had the words for that feeling for years yet. By the time she was old enough to drive, she was flying. The duster runs herself in the gray hour before sunrise, alone in the cockpit, while Ray watched from the ground, with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that was equal parts pride and terror, learning to read wind the way other kids read books they didn't care about. How a gust moves through wheat before you feel it in the stick. How a stall doesn't announce itself so much as it whispers, a change in the sound of the airflow so subtle you had to have flown 1,000 hours to catch it before it became a problem instead of just information. Her father used to watch from the fence line, on the rare stretches of leave that brought him home to Cedar Hollow. Daniel Holloway, Commander, United States Navy. A man who came home smelling like jet fuel and ocean salt, even after 2 showers, who used to sit at the kitchen table with a napkin and a pen and draw intercept geometry for his daughter, like it was a bedtime story. The two of them hunched over the table, while her mother rolled her eyes fondly from the stove and said, "The girl's going to think angles are how you say good night." He never got old enough to see her earn her wings. 12 years ago. A training accident nobody ever fully explained to a 13-year-old girl standing in a church basement in a black dress, 2 sizes too big, borrowed from a cousin, because nobody had thought to buy her anything appropriate for a funeral, because nobody in that family had ever imagined they'd need something appropriate for a funeral this early. The official report said pilot error. The Navy folded the flag and handed it to her mother in a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes, and that was, apparently, supposed to be the end of it. A folded flag and 11 minutes and a report that closed the book on a man's entire life in a handful of bureaucratic sentences. It was never the end of it. Not for Wren. She'd kept his old flight logbook. Cracked leather cover, the corners worn soft and pale from years of handling. His handwriting gone soft at the edges from 12 years of being opened and closed and opened again, late at night, in dorm rooms and barracks rooms and the back seat of a truck parked on the shoulder of some highway when the missing him got too big to keep driving through. She didn't need it to remember him. Memory didn't work like that, she'd learned. Memory didn't need props. She needed it because somewhere in those pages, she was sure, was a man who never once in his life made the kind of mistake they said killed him. A man too careful, too exact, too much like the man who used to draw geometry on napkins and double-check everything twice before he ever trusted it once. She just didn't know yet what she was going to do about that. Not yet. Her mother had asked her once, the night before she left for flight school, sitting on the porch steps with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between them, whether she was doing this for herself or for him. Wren hadn't had an answer then. Didn't fully have one now, 7 years and 1 commission later. Both, probably, she'd finally said. Is that allowed? Her mother had looked at her a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. It's allowed, she'd said. Just don't let it be only him. You have to want it enough on your own, or the wanting won't carry you through the parts he's not there to see. Wren had thought about that a lot since, especially on mornings like the ones ahead of her now, mornings that started before the sun and ended with her hands too tired to properly hold a pen for the debrief notes. She wanted it. She was almost sure of that. But the other thing lived underneath the wanting, like a second engine nobody could see from outside the aircraft, quiet and constant, and she wasn't sure yet how to separate the two, even if she'd wanted to try. Weeks moved the way hard weeks do. Slow inside each day, blurred looking back at them, the way a long stretch of highway blurs into a single gray memory of driving, rather than any one particular mile. Pre-dawn sim sessions that started before the coffee was ready. The base, still dark, except for the sodium lights over the parking lot and the flight line, everyone moving through the cold with a particular hunched efficiency of people who hadn't fully woken up, but had a job to do anyway. Academic blocks that bled into afternoon heat, classroom windows fogged slightly from too many bodies and not enough air conditioning. Low-level routes through the coastal foothills that soaked every flight suit clean through by the time you climbed down the ladder, sweat and adrenaline in equal measure. Wren kept pace, never flashy, never behind. Flew clean sorties, debriefed in short exact sentences, went back to the BOQ while everybody else headed for the club, the sound of their laughter following her partway down the hall, before the door swung shut behind them and left her with silence again. What people noticed mostly was her absence of noise. What they didn't see was the hours after. Alone in the empty tactics room, the overhead lights buzzing faintly, running intercept geometry past midnight on scratch paper, until the lines stopped being arithmetic and started being instinct. Because that's what her father used to say, scratching numbers on a napkin at the kitchen table while her mother pretended to be annoyed by the mess. It's not math once you can feel it. It's just true. She took the 400 sim blocks nobody else wanted, the ones that meant setting an alarm for 350 and driving to the base in headlight-lit darkness while most of the squadron was still asleep. Read every mishap report in the squadron safety library, a thick binder kept in a locked cabinet most junior officers never bothered opening. Not because anyone assigned it to her, because she wanted to understand every single way a good pilot could still lose an airplane. So she never would. So her father never should have. That thought sat underneath every report she read, though she never let herself dwell on it long enough to feel its full weight. Just enough to keep reading. Just enough to keep learning. There was one flight in October nobody in that squadron would ever remember. Except her. A low-altitude training run through the foothills. Dawn light barely up, gold and pink bleeding across a sky still mostly gray, and a sensor fault fed her bad altitude data at the exact wrong second, the kind of malfunction that happened rarely enough that most pilots went entire careers without encountering it in a live aircraft. Most pilots at her level would have trusted the numbers. That's what the numbers are for. That's what 4 years of flight school drilled into you. Trust the instruments. Trust the instruments. Trust the instruments. Because human senses lie and machines mostly don't. Wren didn't. Because something about the way the aircraft felt didn't line up with what the gauges were telling her. A half-second of wrongness. A whisper under the readout. Some part of her inner ear, or her muscle memory, or whatever combination of instinct her body had built over a decade of flying dusters low over Montana wheat, insisting that the numbers on the panel and the reality vine outside the canopy had quietly stopped agreeing with each other. She flew the airplane instead of the panel. Leveled off on feel alone, breath held, every nerve in her body screaming at her to trust the instruments even as her hands did the opposite. Brought it home clean, gear down. Nothing on the tapes but a routine landing that nobody in the tower even looked twice at. She taxied to the line, shut down. Sat in the cockpit for a long moment after the engine spooled to silence, her hands trembling slightly now that the emergency, if it had even been one, was fully over. She wrote 3 lines about it in her personal logbook that night, back in the barracks, the lamp on the small desk, casting a narrow cone of yellow light over the page, and never told a soul, because to her it wasn't a story. It was the same instinct her Uncle Ray had drilled into her over Montana wheat fields a decade earlier. An instinct didn't need an audience to be real. It just needed to be right when it mattered. Her roommate was a logistics officer named Dana Whitfield, no relation to the base, a coincidence she found endlessly funny and brought up at least once a week. Sharp elbows, sharper opinions, a laugh that carried through drywall, and had already gotten them a noise complaint from the room next door within the first 10 days. Dana talked enough for both of them, which suited Wren fine. She'd fill the room with stories about her own day, complaints about the supply chain paperwork that ate most of her hours, gossip about which pilots were dating which other pilots, and Wren would listen from her side of the room, offering a nod here, a small laugh there, enough participation to keep the friendship comfortable without ever having to fill silence herself. She noticed the light under Wren's door, or rather, since they shared the room, the lamp still burning past midnight night after night. Noticed Wren leaving for the flight line already looking like she'd been up for hours. Because she had been. "You ever sleep?" Dana asked once, half a joke tossed off while she brushed her teeth at the small shared sink. "Sometimes," Wren said, and left it there. What Dana didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the sleep Wren gave up wasn't wasted time to her. It was the same trade she'd made her whole life. Duster runs instead of sleeping in. Diner shifts instead of a normal Friday night. Back in the years she'd worked her way through a state flight program, on loans and scholarship money, and whatever hours a small-town diner could offer a teenager willing to take the early shift nobody else wanted. She never believed preparation cost too much. She just never minded paying for it. "You're gonna burn out," Dana told her once, not unkindly, setting a mug of tea on Wren's desk without being asked, a small gesture that Wren noticed and appreciated more than she said out loud. "Maybe," Wren said. "That's not reassuring. Wasn't meant to be." A small, tired smile. "I appreciate the tea, though." Dana had rolled her eyes, but she kept bringing the tea anyway, most nights after that, setting it down and leaving without a word, and Wren understood that as its own quiet kind of care, the kind that didn't need acknowledgement to keep happening. February came in gray and wet, rain sheeting sideways across the flight line for 3 straight days, grounding everything, turning the ready room into a waiting room full of restless pilots with nowhere to burn off energy. Boyle spent most of it complaining loudly about the weather, like the weather owed him a personal apology. Riddle read a paperback in the corner, unbothered. Stonewall did paperwork nobody else wanted to do, the way senior officers sometimes absorbed the tedious work just to keep it moving. That was the weak word came down. 2 slots. Open. For the Advanced Tactics Detachment at Naval Air Station Ashcombe. Corrigan delivered the announcement the way he delivered everything, flat and efficient, standing at the front of the ready room with a printed memo in one hand. 6 weeks, he said. 2 names go forward from this squadron. I'll want packages by end of week if you're serious about it. 6 weeks that could shape the next 5 years of a career. Everybody in that room knew the reputation, the kind of program that fed the Navy's most demanding instructor pipeline. The kind of program where washing out didn't just sting, it followed you, showed up in fitness reports for years afterward, like a scar that never quite faded. Boyle announced he was putting his name in before Corrigan had even finished the briefing sentence, his hand half raised like he was answering a question nobody had asked. Riddle said the same thing. Quieter, more measured, the kind of certainty that didn't need volume to be heard. Stonewall just nodded once, and the room understood that nod to mean he'd already decided somewhere behind his eyes days ago, maybe before the memo had even been typed. Nobody noticed Wren get up. Nobody noticed her walk down the hall to the admin office that same afternoon and quietly, without a word to anyone, submit her own package. The clerk behind the desk barely glanced at her name before stamping the folder and setting it in a tray with the others. Because why would they notice? She was the quiet one, the one who ate alone, the one Boyle called Library Energy in front of 8 laughing people, a nickname that had stuck around longer than he probably meant it to. whispered sometimes in the hallway when she passed, not always unkindly but never quite kindly either. Selection wasn't close to guaranteed. Historically, fewer than one nominated pilot in 5 made the cut. The review board was merciless records, sim performance, a battery of tactical exams that eliminated most candidates before they ever touched an airplane at Ashcombe. Wren had heard stories, secondhand, of pilots with strong reputations getting cut in the first round simply because the intercept geometry exam ate them alive, a section of the test specifically designed to punish anyone who hadn't internalized three-dimensional tactical thinking deeply enough to do it under pressure. Wren filled out the paperwork with the same flat, careful hand she used for everything. Listed her flight hours, her academic scores, a short essay section asking why she wanted the assignment, which she filled in with 3 honest sentences and nothing more, because she'd learned that padding never fooled anyone who actually read these things for a living. Then she went back to the tactics room and kept working, because whether she made it or not, the work was never actually about the room in the first place. It never had been. The next 3 weeks passed the way weeks do when you're pretending not to be waiting for something, each day stretching a little longer than it should, each glance at her phone or her email a little more frequent than she wanted to admit to herself. She flew her regular sorties, studied at night, ate lunch alone, mostly, though Dana had started sitting with her more often, a small unspoken alliance forming between them that neither one bothered naming out loud. Once in the tactics room past midnight, she found herself staring at her father's logbook instead of her scratch paper, the leather cover worn soft under her thumb. She hadn't meant to pull it out. It had just ended up in her bag that morning, the way it sometimes did on days when the missing hymn sat a little heavier than usual, and she found herself turning to a page near the middle, an entry about a training exercise that had nothing to do with anything she was studying, just because she wanted to hear his voice in her head for a minute before she kept working. Diverted 20 minutes off profile due to weather trend, he'd written in that cramped, careful hand. Better safe than efficient. Command wasn't thrilled, landed anyway. She'd smiled at that, a small private smile in an empty room. Better safe than efficient. That sounded exactly like him. She closed the logbook, put it away, went back to the geometry. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, Corrigan's inbox lit up with a message from the selection board. He read it once, then again. Then he called an all-hands muster for that same afternoon, no explanation given, and the whole squadron filed into the ready room, assuming the way rooms full of confident people always assume that they already knew how the story went. Boyle's slot. Maybe Riddle's too. Maybe Stonewall had asked to instruct instead of attend, because senior guys sometimes did that, passed the torch instead of chasing it themselves. Chairs scraped, coffee cups filled one more time before people settled in. Boyle leaned back in his seat with the loose, easy posture of a man who already knew what he was about to hear, already half composing his acceptance face. Corrigan stood at the front, holding the printed message at his side for a moment before he spoke, the way a man does when he wants to get it exactly right, when he understands that the next sentence out of his mouth is going to rearrange something in the room, whether he intends it to or not. One name came back selected, he said. Top of the entire board's ranking. Highest tactical academic score submitted from any squadron on this base this cycle. Perfect marks on the intercept geometry portion, the one that usually eats people alive. He scanned the rows. Read the name slow, like it needed the extra weight to land properly. Lieutenant Junior Grade Wren Holloway. The room went still, not ordinary quiet. The particular stillness of a fact refusing to fit the picture people had already built in their heads. Minds stalling out, visibly, trying to force the new information into a shape it clearly did not want to take. Boyle set his coffee down without noticing he'd done it, the mug clinking against the metal folding table, loud enough in the sudden silence that a couple of heads turned toward the sound, instead of toward Corrigan. Riddle's eyebrows went up and stayed up, her paperback forgotten in her lap. Stonewall found Wren exactly where she always sat. Back row, level expression, giving nothing away, though something in her hands folded a little too tightly in her lap, suggested the stillness cost her more than it looked like it did. Holloway. Corrigan again. You want to tell me why nobody in this room knew you'd even put in for this? Wren considered the question, the way she considered everything. Slowly, fully, then arrived at the only honest answer available to her. Nobody asked. Sir. A few uncomfortable laughs, quickly swallowed, the kind of laugh that comes out before a person decides whether laughing is actually appropriate. Corrigan didn't laugh. He kept reading. The board's written comments used language that didn't usually show up in these reports. An unusually mature grasp of three-dimensional tactical geometry. The kind instructors normally expected from pilots several years further along in their careers. On the merge plan portion of the exam, the section that eliminated half the applicant pool every single cycle she hadn't just passed, she'd proposed a solution the board hadn't anticipated. One that 2 evaluators had reportedly already folded into their own teaching material before the cycle even closed. Corrigan read that part twice, his eyebrows lifting slightly, before he set the paper down. She'd been preparing for months, he added, and it wasn't clear whether he was reading that from the report or simply stating what had become obvious to everyone in the room in the last 90 seconds. The 400 blocks, the midnight hours in the tactics room. The mishap reports nobody assigned her to read. The room shifted, a low murmur passing through it, people exchanging glances that all seemed to say some version of the same thing. How did we miss this? Because she had never once asked a single person in that squadron to believe in her before the work was already done. And that, more than anything else, seemed to be the part the room was struggling hardest to process. Not that she'd succeeded, that she'd never once asked for permission to try. The days that followed were, in their own small way, a reckoning. Nothing dramatic. No apologies said out loud in front of everybody. No grand scene of contrition. But the room's temperature shifted the way it does when a fact finally outweighs the story people had been telling themselves in its place, a slow recalibration that happened mostly in small gestures nobody would have called significant on their own. Boyle went quiet for 2 full days. Genuinely quiet, a version of him nobody in the squadron had seen before, subdued in the ready room, less inclined to fill every silence with a story about himself. On the 3rd day, he found her in the maintenance hangar, wiping her hands on a rag after helping a crew chief with something that hadn't strictly required her presence, and asked without any of his usual performance attached to it if she'd walk him through her merge plan logic sometime. Sure, she said. Simple. No triumph in it. No reminder of the joke he'd made weeks earlier. Just an answer. She spent 40 minutes at a folding table in the corner of the hangar, explaining decision trees 3 moves ahead, sketching vectors on the back of a maintenance form because it was the only paper within reach. The way a chess player thinks 2 captures past the obvious one, she told him, echoing something her father used to say, though she didn't tell Boyle where the phrase came from. He listened, the way people listen when they realize, mid-conversation, that they've been underestimating someone for weeks, without a single good reason, his questions getting sharper and more genuine as the 40 minutes went on, less about proving himself and more about actually wanting to understand. I owe you an apology, he said, near the end, not quite meeting her eyes. The library thing, that wasn't fair. It's fine, Wren said. It wasn't, though. She considered that. No, she agreed. It wasn't, but it's still fine. People say things before they know better. What matters is what you do after. He nodded slowly, something settling in his face that looked almost like relief. Riddle admitted at the bar that night, low enough that only Wren could hear it over the noise of the room, that she'd read her completely wrong. I had you filed as somebody just trying to survive the assignment, she said. Turns out you were the one running the whole syllabus in your head this whole time. I wasn't trying to prove anything, Wren said. I know, Riddle said. That's the part that got me. Stonewall said nothing directly, but the next flight schedule paired Wren with him for a 2-ship sortie, a pairing that hadn't existed before and that nobody had to explain the meaning of. In a fighter squadron, that was its own quiet form of respect. Nobody had to say it out loud for it to count. Corrigan wrote a line in her fitness report that would follow her for the rest of her career. He didn't tell her what it said. She didn't ask. Some things she'd learned mattered more left unread, trusted rather than confirmed. The weeks between selection and departure moved differently than the weeks before had. Less like waiting, more like preparing in the specific and deliberate way Wren approached everything that mattered to her. She ran extra sims when the schedule allowed it. Reread the mishap binder cover to cover one more time. Slower this time, letting herself actually sit with some of the harder cases, instead of just cataloging them for information. Studied old exam questions from previous ATD cycles that Riddle, unexpectedly, had a stash of from a friend who'd gone through the program 2 years earlier and passed them along without being asked. Figured you'd want these, Riddle said, dropping a thin folder on Wren's desk in the ready room one afternoon. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Half of these questions made me want to throw my helmet at a wall. A small, genuine smile. You'll do fine, Holloway, you don't know that. No, Riddle agreed. But I've got a pretty good read on people by now. And my read on you says you'll be fine. She paused at the door. For what it's worth. I'm glad it's you going instead of me this cycle. I don't think I'd have handled the pressure half as well. Wren didn't quite know what to say to that, settled finally on the truth. I don't know if I'll handle it well either. Nobody ever does going in, Riddle said. That's not really the question that matters. The night before she left for Ashcombe, Wren sat on the edge of her bed with her father's logbook open on her knees, the barracks room quiet, except for Dana's steady breathing from the other side of the room, asleep hours earlier, the way normal people slept the night before an early morning. The cover was soft now. 12 years of hands doing that to leather. The leather itself gone the color of strong tea, worn pale at the corners, where a thumb naturally rested when opening it. She didn't read it exactly. She'd read it so many times the words had stopped being words and started being something closer to a voice. His voice. Steady, careful. A man who double-checked everything, who taught his daughter to read wind before he ever taught her to read a map, who believed better safe than efficient enough to write it down and mean it. A man the Navy's own paperwork said had made a fatal mistake. She closed the logbook because she wasn't ready yet to say the thing sitting underneath that thought, the thing she'd been carrying since she was 13 years old in a black dress 2 sizes too big, standing in a church basement, smelling like old coffee and lilies, watching people she barely knew hug her mother and say things like he's in a better place now, words that had never once made her feel better, not then and not in the 12 years since. Which was this. She didn't believe it, had never believed it, not for one single day, and now she was going somewhere with instructors who'd flown for 20 years, who might have heard names, who might remember things a 13-year-old girl in a church basement had never been in a position to ask about, had never even known to ask about, because grief at 13 didn't leave much room for investigation. Except she wasn't going there for that. She told herself that, firmly. Firmly, the way you tell yourself something you're only 60% sure of, repeating it until the repetition starts to feel a little more like conviction than it actually is. She was going there to fly. That was all. That was the whole reason. So why did her hand keep resting on the cover of that logbook, like it was something alive, something with a pulse she could feel through the leather if she held still long enough? She sat with that question a long time, the lamp on the desk casting its narrow cone of yellow light, the rest of the room dark and quiet around her. Then she packed the logbook, wrapped in the old flannel shirt, same as always. At the bottom of the same sea bag she'd carried across 1,400 miles of highway 6 months earlier, and would now carry another several hundred miles further into a stretch of Nevada desert she'd never once set foot in. She left before dawn, the way she left most places, the base still mostly dark and quiet around her, a few lights on in the chow hall, where the earliest risers were already lining up for breakfast. Dana had woken up just long enough to mumble good luck, Holloway from under her blanket, and Wren had smiled in the dark room, grateful for it, even though Dana probably wouldn't remember saying it by the time she actually woke up for real. The drive to Ashcombe took most of the day. Nevada desert, stretching out flat and pale in every direction. Distant mountains, standing blue and hazy on the horizon like a rumor rather than a real place. She stopped once for gas and a bad cup of coffee at a station that seemed to exist purely to serve travelers passing through on their way to somewhere else. Nobody's actual destination, just a waypoint. She thought, more than once during that long stretch of empty highway, about the fitness report Corrigan had written and never shown her. About Riddle's folder of old exam questions still sitting in her bag. About her father's logbook riding along at the bottom of the sea bag in the truck bed, wrapped in flannel, 12 years of unanswered questions traveling with her into whatever 6 weeks was about to become. She didn't know yet how much those 6 weeks would actually cost her. Nobody ever knows that going in. That's not really the question that matters, Riddle had said. Wren was starting to understand what she'd meant. Naval Air Station Ashcombe sat in a flat, gray stretch of Nevada desert, mountains standing distant and blue on every horizon, like they were watching and had opinions they weren't sharing. The base itself felt older somehow than Whitfield Point, more weathered. Buildings that had clearly been standing through decades of desert sun and wind, their paint gone chalky and pale. Wren checked in on a Monday morning, sea bag over her shoulder, and found the visiting officer's quarters mostly empty. Early. She liked early. Early meant she could see a room before the room decided anything about her. The room itself was smaller than the barracks at Whitfield Point. A narrow bed, a narrow desk, a window looking out over a stretch of tarmac already shimmering faintly with early heat. She unpacked quickly, the same careful precision as before. The shoebox tucked at the back of the closet shelf. The logbook set on the desk this time, instead of buried at the bottom of the bag, close enough to reach if she needed it. She hadn't needed it yet. Something told her she would, before this was over. The Advanced Tactics Detachment Ready Room, when she found it 2 hours later, looked nothing like ironclads. Bigger, colder somehow, despite the desert heat pressing against the windows. The air conditioning working harder here than it had at Whitfield Point, the room kept at a temperature that felt almost aggressive against the heat outside. Rows of chairs facing a wall-covered floor to ceiling with tactics diagrams. Mission boards. A whiteboard wiped so many times it had gone permanently gray at the edges. Decades of chalk dust and marker ghosted into the surface, no matter how thoroughly anyone cleaned it. 6 other pilots were already seated when she walked in. Nobody here knew her either. Which was almost a relief. A blank page instead of a half-written one. A chance to be seen fresh instead of through the lens of library energy and 8 laughing people. Almost. She found a seat near the back. Old habit. Set her folder on her knees, waited. The instructor cadre filed in at exactly 800. 4 of them, sharp and unhurried, and Wren catalogued each face the way she catalogued everything, quickly, quietly, filing it somewhere she could pull it back up later if it mattered. Except one face stopped her cold. Commander Holt Draven. Because she knew that name. Not from any official record. Not from anything printed. From 3 words, handwritten, in the margin of a logbook that had lived at the bottom of her sea bag for 12 years. Tucked now instead into the drawer of a narrow government desk, not 50 feet from where she was currently sitting. Draven says hold. Draven wrong. Her father's handwriting. Her father's hand, 12 years dead, had written that name down and underlined it once, hard enough to tear the page slightly, and never explained a single thing about what it meant, leaving his daughter to carry a fragment for over a decade without any context to attach it to. And here he was, standing at the front of a room in Nevada, older now, gray threading through dark hair, a voice like something worn smooth by a lot of years and a lot of weight, introducing himself to a room of pilots who had no idea that one of them had been carrying his name around in her chest for over a decade like a stone she couldn't put down. Commander Draven, he said. I'll be running your tactics evaluations for the next 6 weeks. Wren's pen didn't move. Her face didn't move. But something under her ribs went very, very still. The same stillness she'd felt at 8 years old in a jump seat over a Montana wheat field. Except this time it wasn't the opposite of fear. This time she wasn't sure what it was at all. Only that it had weight, and that the weight had been waiting a very long time for a face to finally attach itself to. Fictional story. All characters, units, locations, and events depicted are invented for entertainment purposes and do not represent real persons, military units, or historical operations. The quiet one they called Whisper. Part 2. Ren's pen still hadn't moved. Draven had gone on talking. Course structure. Grading criteria. The 6 weeks laid out like a map nobody in that room had walked yet. His voice moving through the material with the flat competence of a man who had given this exact briefing more times than he could probably count. His voice didn't shake, didn't hitch, didn't do anything at all, except sound exactly like what it was. A commander running a briefing on a Monday morning in a room that had seen dozens of Monday mornings just like it. She heard maybe half of it, because the other half of her was still standing in a church basement in a black dress, 2 sizes too big, watching a folded flag get pressed into her mother's hands, and a man named Draven had never once been in that basement, had never once had to be. He'd just been a name. 2 words in the margin of a dead man's logbook, underlined hard enough to tear the paper, carried around for 12 years like a stone, with no context attached to it, a stone she'd learned to stop noticing the weight of most days. Draven says hold. Draven wrong. That was all she had. That and a face at the front of the room that fit no memory. No photograph. Nothing except the sudden, sick certainty that whatever this 6 weeks was supposed to be about, it had just quietly become about something else too. Something that had been waiting patiently at the bottom of a sea bag for a decade to finally get its chance. She wrote his name down in her notebook. Nothing else. Just the name. Underlined once, the pen pressing slightly harder into the paper than it needed to, the same way her father's pen must have pressed 12 years earlier. She didn't decide to do that. Her hand did it before the rest of her caught up. Some old inherited instinct moving through her fingers without asking permission first. She looked up, made herself look up, because staring at a notebook too long was its own kind of tell, and the last thing she wanted in the first 10 minutes of a 6-week program was to give anyone a reason to wonder what she was writing. Draven had moved on to the syllabus overview. Academic blocks in the mornings. Flight scenarios in the afternoons, weather and range availability permitting. Final evaluation at the end of week 6, the tape from which would follow every trainee for the rest of their careers, whether they wanted it to or not. This program does not exist to make you feel good about yourselves, Draven said, and something in the flatness of the delivery suggested he'd said this line too, more times than he could count. It exists to find out, in a controlled environment, exactly where your limits are. Better to find that out here, in front of instructors, than to find it out later, in front of an adversary who isn't grading you. He's killing you. Nobody in the room said anything. Questions, Draven said. It wasn't really a question itself, more a formality, a box to check before moving on. Nobody raised a hand. Good, Draven said. See you all at 1,300 on the flight line. 6 trainees total. Small class, by design. ATD didn't run big cohorts. Corrigan had told her once, back at Whitfield Point, standing in the doorway of his office with a cup of coffee in his hand, while he ran through what to expect, because the washout rate did the culling for them anyway, and there wasn't much point training people. The program was going to spit back out in week 2. Ren sat between 2 strangers, the same way she'd sat between strangers in a dozen classrooms before this one. The particular loneliness of being new made almost comfortable through repetition. To her left, a lieutenant with a jaw like he'd been cast for the part, call sign already earned somewhere else, stitched on his flight suit in block letters that had clearly been sewn on with pride. Bishop. He had the kind of confidence that filled a room a full 2 seconds before the rest of him arrived, elbows on his knees, leaning forward like he was ready to start the whole program right that second, if somebody would just let him. Ironclad had Boyle. Every squadron had one. Apparently every detachment did too. Some universal law of fighter pilot physics that guaranteed at least one loud, confident presence in every room full of aviators. To her right, a woman. Dark hair pulled back tight, sharp collarbones, a scar through one eyebrow that told its own story, and clearly didn't feel like sharing it yet. She caught Ren looking, and didn't look away first, holding the eye contact a half-second longer than most strangers would, like she was running her own quiet assessment, and didn't mind Ren knowing it. Ledger, she said. Quiet. Just the one word offered like a password, like something you only handed over if you decided the other person was worth the trade. Holloway, Ren said back. No first name? Ren. Ledger's not my first name either. A pause. Almost a smile, almost. Naomi. But nobody's called me that since flight school, and I'd like to keep it that way. Ren almost smiled back, almost. Because that was new. Nobody at Whitfield Point had offered her a first name in the first 10 minutes. Nobody had offered her anything in the first 10 minutes, not even a nod, not for the first 3 days. Why Ledger? Ren asked. Of everything. Every merge. Every mistake. My own included. A beat. You'll hate me by Thursday. I doubt that. Everybody does. It's fine. She said it lightly. Like it cost nothing. Ren suspected it cost something. Where are you coming from? Ren asked. VFA 61 out of Coring Naval Air Station. Naomi shrugged, a small economical motion. You? Ironclad. Whitfield Point. I've heard of Ironclad. Naomi's eyebrows lifted slightly. Heard the ready room culture is rough on new arrivals. Ren considered how to answer that. It's gotten better, she said finally. That's a diplomatic answer. I'm a diplomatic person. Naomi actually laughed at that, a short surprised sound, quickly suppressed but real while it lasted. We'll see about that, she said. 6 weeks in this place has a way of stripping the diplomacy off people. You'll see what I mean by week 3. Draven ran the morning academics himself. Most days, though occasionally one of the other 3 instructors took a session when scheduling required it. Whiteboard covered edge to edge in vectors, closure rates, numbers that used to just be numbers to Ren before her father taught her, at a kitchen table in Cedar Hollow, that you could feel them instead of calculating them if you let yourself sit with the geometry long enough. She watched Draven's hands while he talked. Steady, no wasted motion. The same economy she recognized in her own hands, though she couldn't have said why that unsettled her the way it did. Some deep uncomfortable recognition of a habit she'd assumed was uniquely her father's, uniquely inherited, until he paused. Mid-sentence. Looked down at the roster on his clipboard like he was checking something he already knew. The kind of look a person gives a piece of information they've been half expecting and half dreading in equal measure. Holloway, he said. She sat up. Sir, any relation to a Daniel Holloway? Commander back. He stopped himself. Just slightly, a half-second hitch nobody else in that room would have caught. A stumble so small it might have been mistaken for nothing more than a man losing his train of thought for a beat. She caught it. My father, Ren said. Flat, careful, the same voice she used for everything that mattered too much to let show. The voice she'd practiced for years without ever fully realizing she was practicing it. Something crossed Draven's face, gone before she could name it. Filed away behind 20 years of practice at not showing things in front of a room, the same practice she'd built her own version of over the last 12 years. Good pilot, he said, finally, quietly. I flew with him once or twice. Once or twice. Her father's handwriting said otherwise. Her father's handwriting had underlined that name so hard it tore the page, and torn pages, in Ren's experience, didn't come from once or twice. She didn't say any of that, just nodded. Thank you, sir. Draven went back to the whiteboard, but his hand wasn't quite as steady drawing the next vector, the line coming out slightly less clean than the ones before it, a small wobble that a room full of tired trainees probably didn't notice. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Noticing was the only thing she'd ever been good at, that nobody gave her credit for. A skill built out of years of sitting quietly in rooms and watching everyone else, because watching had always been easier for her than talking, and had always, in the end, told her more. For the rest of that session, she found her attention splitting itself in two directions at once. Half on the material, half on Draven, cataloging the small things. The way his eyes moved to her seat a beat too often. The way his voice, steady through most of the lecture, tightened almost imperceptibly whenever the conversation drifted anywhere near flight safety history, mishap analysis, the kind of subject matter that would have been unremarkable in any other instructor's mouth. She told herself she was imagining it. She did not fully believe herself. That first week settled into a rhythm that felt, on its surface, almost identical to the rhythm she'd built at Whitfield Point. Early mornings, academic blocks, afternoon flights when weather and range time allowed, evening debriefs that ran long enough to eat into whatever was left of the day. Bishop turned out to be exactly what his posture had promised on day one. Aggressive in the cockpit, quick to commit to a plan and slow to second-guess it. The kind of pilot who flew on instinct and confidence in roughly equal measure, sometimes to spectacular effect and sometimes to his own detriment. He and Wren fell into an easy enough rapport. By the end of the first week, less friendship than mutual professional respect, the kind that formed naturally between two people who happened to be assigned as wingmen more often than not. "You fly weird," he told her once, on a Tuesday, the two of them walking back from the flight line after a scenario that had gone reasonably well for both of them. "Weird how?" "Careful, like you're always leaving yourself an out." He shook his head. "I don't do that. I commit. I noticed," Wren said dryly. "It works for me until it doesn't." He laughed at that, a genuine sound. "Fair. You're not wrong." Naomi, meanwhile, became something closer to an actual friend, the kind Wren hadn't really allowed herself since flight school, back when the friendships still had room to grow slowly, instead of being crowded out by the discipline of always keeping her guard half raised. They ate meals together most days, studied together in the evenings when the schedule allowed for it, spreading tactics diagrams across a table in the small break room off the ready room. Naomi's habit of narrating her own thought process out loud, turning out to be genuinely useful for Wren, who thought mostly in silence and found it clarifying to hear someone else's reasoning laid bare. "You don't talk much when you fly," Naomi observed once, over the radio during a joint debrief review, the two of them alone in the break room with a tape paused on the screen between them. "I talk when it matters." "Everything you say matters then." "That's a lot of pressure to put on your own vocabulary." Wren considered that. "Maybe," she admitted. "I've never really thought about it that way." "Most people who don't waste words haven't," Naomi said. "That's kind of the point of not wasting them." The desert did something to sound, made the jets louder somehow, bouncing off flat ground and distant mountains until the whole sky seemed to be shouting at once. Wren stood on the flight line that first Thursday morning watching heat shimmer come up off the tarmac in waves, already sweating through her flight suit before she'd even strapped in. The desert sun a different kind of heat than anything Cedar Hollow or even Whitfield Point had prepared her for. Dry and relentless and strangely honest in the way it refused to pretend to be anything softer than what it was. Dissimilar air combat training. That was the phrase on the schedule, which meant instructors flying adversary aircraft, built and trained to exploit whatever weakness a young pilot didn't yet know she had. Decades of institutional knowledge about exactly how young pilots thought and where they broke under pressure, which meant on Thursday that adversary was Draven himself. She climbed the ladder, settled into the cockpit, ran the checklist the way she always ran it, unhurried, thorough, her father's voice somewhere in the back of her skull, the way it always was during pre-flight. Check it twice, then check it again. The airplane doesn't care how confident you feel. Except today her hands weren't quite steady either, because the man she was about to fly against had a name underlined in a dead man's logbook, and she had absolutely no idea what that meant yet, and not knowing was its own kind of turbulence, the kind you couldn't trim out, no matter how careful you were, no matter how many times you ran through the checklist, hoping the repetition might settle something that had nothing to do with the aircraft at all. She pushed it down, sealed the canopy, took off into a sky the color of old bone, the ground falling away beneath her in the particular silence that always arrived once the wheels left the runway, a silence that had nothing to do with noise and everything to do with the strange stillness that lived inside real speed. The scenario was simple on paper. Two-ship defensive engagement. Draven and another instructor as the aggressors, Wren and Bishop flying wing. It did not stay simple. Bishop got separated in the first 90 seconds, chasing a shot that wasn't there, committing hard the way he always committed hard, and Wren found herself alone against two adversary aircraft who had spent careers learning exactly how young pilots thought under pressure, exactly which reads they'd trust and which ones they'd second-guess a half-second too long. She did what she'd always done. Flew the geometry, read the merge, trusted the numbers her father had taught her to feel instead of calculate, running the intercept in her head the same way she'd run 1,000 practice scenarios on scratch paper in an empty tactics room at midnight. It wasn't enough. Draven's aircraft came out of a scissor she hadn't seen building, a half-second faster than she'd accounted for, closing a gap that shouldn't have existed if her read had been accurate, and the radio call came flat and final. Guns. Holloway, you're dead. Just like that. Just 4 words and the whole settee was over, and somewhere in the part of her brain that never stopped running numbers, she already knew exactly which decision point had killed her. She'd trusted a read that was half a second too slow, the same half second she'd learn later, that separated everyone in this business from everyone who washed out of it, a margin so thin most people spent their whole careers without ever fully closing the gap. She flew the RTB in silence, landed clean, because whatever else was happening in her chest, her hands still knew how to land an airplane, the muscle memory of 1,000 landings taking over, even when the rest of her felt scattered. Taxied in, shut down, sat in the cockpit for 1 extra beat before she climbed the ladder down, because she needed that 1 extra beat to arrange her face into something that wouldn't give anything away in the debrief. It didn't help. The debrief room had a projector screen bolted to one wall, and 11 chairs, and every single one of them was full, because that was how ATD ran it. Every kill, every death dissected in front of the whole class. No mercy in the format. No mercy intended. It was, Wren was starting to understand, the entire point of the exercise. Public failure examined in exhaustive detail until the lesson embedded itself somewhere deeper than pride could protect. Draven pulled up her tape, ran it frame by frame, froze it at the exact moment the scissor collapsed, at the exact half-second where she'd trusted a read that wasn't quite there yet. The image on the screen paused mid-motion. 2 aircraft caught in a geometric relationship that told the whole story before he'd said a single word about it. "Talk me through this decision," he said. She talked him through it. Voice level. Because she'd learned a long time ago that level was the only voice worth using when everything underneath it wanted to shake, a lesson learned first in a church basement at 13, and reinforced in every hard room since. He listened, didn't interrupt, then quiet, almost gentle, in a way that somehow made it worse. "You saw the picture half a second late. That's not a mistake most people ever fix. That's the mistake that decides who gets to keep doing this." The room was silent. Bishop, 2 seats over, wasn't even bothering to hide the small satisfied twitch at the corner of his mouth. Because everyone loved watching the quiet one get taken apart. It confirmed something people needed to believe about themselves. Some private comfort in watching someone else's precision fail publicly. Wren said, "Understood, sir." 2 words, that was all she trusted herself to say out loud. Inside, though, inside it was not 2 words. Inside it was a whole collapsing structure, 12 years of proving herself, all of it, suddenly feeling like it had been standing on ground that wasn't as solid as she'd thought it was. Because what if Boyle had been right? What if library energy was exactly what this was? What if her father's daughter didn't actually have what her father had, and she'd just spent a decade convincing herself otherwise because the alternative was unbearable, because a daughter who couldn't fly the way her father flew had to find some other way to carry him, and she'd never once considered what that other way might look like. Except, except that thought didn't sound like her own voice. It sounded like Boyle's, echoing from a Wednesday months ago, in a different, ready room 1,000 miles away, which meant she didn't have to keep it. She filed it anyway. Because filing things, even the ugly ones, was easier than throwing them away. A habit built over years of never quite trusting herself to let anything go completely. That night the visiting officer's quarters felt smaller than they had that morning. Wren sat on the thin mattress, with her boots still on, staring at the wall, replaying the merge over and over until the geometry blurred into something that wasn't even shapes anymore. Just failure. Just the flat sound of Draven's voice saying you're dead, looping in her head with a persistence that felt almost cruel in its repetition. Her phone buzzed. Uncle Ray. Because Uncle Ray always called on Thursdays. Had, for years. Ever since her father died, and somebody in that family needed to keep calling, just to prove the line was still open. A ritual neither of them had ever formally agreed to, but both of them had kept without fail. "How's the desert treating you?" he said. "No hello." Ray never did hello. "Fine. That's not an answer, Birdie. Nobody else on Earth called her that, only Ray. Only since she was 8, strapped into that jump seat, and he'd said she flew like a bird that hadn't decided yet if it trusted its wings, a nickname that had outlived every other nickname anyone had ever tried to give her. "I got shot down today," she said. Finally, the words coming out smaller than she meant them to, in front of everybody. A pause on the line. Wind somewhere behind him. Montana wind, the kind that never really stopped out on the flats. A sound she could picture as clearly as if she were standing in the yard herself. "Your daddy got shot down plenty," Ray said. "Training exercises. Every pilot worth a damn has a tape somewhere that makes them look like an idiot. You know that." This felt different. Why? Because the man who shot me down might know something about how my father died, and I don't know how to ask him, and I don't know if I even should. She didn't say that. "I don't know," she said instead. "Just tired, I think." Ray let the silence sit a second. He'd always been good at that, letting silence do the work words couldn't, a habit she recognized because it was the same one she'd built for herself, maybe inherited from him, before she'd even inherited it from her father. "You still got that logbook?" "Yeah, then you're not as tired as you think you are." A pause. "Your daddy used to say the worst days were just information, not verdicts. Information." She almost laughed. Almost. That sounds like something he'd say. Man had a saying for everything. Ray's voice went soft in a way it rarely did. "Get some sleep, Birdie. Call me Sunday." He hung up before she could answer, the way he always did, like goodbyes were an unnecessary formality between people who both already knew the conversation wasn't really ending, just pausing. She sat there a long time after, phone dark in her hand, before she finally reached down into her sea bag and pulled out the logbook wrapped in the old flannel shirt. She'd read it 100 times, but she hadn't read it like this before. Not with a name freshly attached to a face. Not with Draven says hold sitting differently. Now that hold had a voice, had hands that didn't quite stay drawing a vector on a whiteboard, had a habit of catching himself mid-sentence whenever her father's name came too close to the surface. She turned the pages slower this time. Most of it was routine, flight hours, fuel loads, the dry bones of a working pilot's professional life. Entry after entry, in a hand that got smaller and more cramped the longer her father flew, like he was trying to fit more truth into less space as the years went on, as though he'd sensed, somewhere in his own body, that the space he had left to fill those pages was more limited than he knew. Then, near the back, an entry dated 11 days before the accident report she'd read so many times she could recite it in her sleep. Briefed low-alt intercept run W.D. Draven as flight lead. Recommended alt profile revision given weather trend. D. Overruled. Proceeded per original profile. Her breath caught. Because that was it. That was the first time in 12 years she'd found her father's own handwriting connecting Draven's name to a decision. Not a feeling. Not a suspicion passed down second-hand through a grieving family. An actual entry dated, specific, in her father's own hand, written by a man who could not have known, writing it, how much weight those two sentences would eventually carry for a daughter who wasn't even a teenager yet. She read it again, then because reading it a third time didn't change what it said, but some part of her kept hoping it might. The way you keep rereading a text message, hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something easier to carry, some gentler version of the same information. D overruled, which meant Draven had been her father's flight lead, which meant Draven had made a call her father disagreed with 11 days before the accident that killed him, a call specific enough that her father had bothered to write it down, underline the name, mark it as something worth remembering, which meant the accident report that said pilot error might not have been telling the whole story at all. She sat with that for a long time, long enough that the light outside the window went from dusk to full dark without her noticing the transition happen. The desert sky outside turning that particular deep blue black that only showed up in places far enough from city light to still remember what real darkness looked like, until a knock at the door made her jump. It was Naomi, Ledger, standing in the hallway in sweatpants and a faded academy t-shirt, holding 2 cans of something from the vending machine. "You didn't come to the club," she said. "Figured you were either dead or brooding. Wasn't sure which." "Brooding," Ren admitted. "Yeah, that was my second guess." Naomi held out one of the cans, root beer, warm from the machine's poor refrigeration. "You want to talk about the debrief, or you want to talk about literally anything else?" Ren almost said nothing else. Almost said thank you and closed the door, the way she'd closed 100 doors before this one, gently but firmly, on people who got a little too close to the parts of her she kept carefully sealed off. Instead, she found herself saying, "Anything else?" Naomi came in, sat on the end of the bed like she'd been invited, which, technically, she had been. "Bishop's an idiot," Naomi said, conversationally, like it was just a known fact, filed under things everyone already agreed on. "You know that, right? Half his kills are luck, and the other half are aggression dressed up as skill. Draven's going to eat him alive by week 3. He looked pretty happy watching me eat it today. That's because Bishop's never once in his life had a bad day where somebody didn't remind him it wasn't the end of the world." Naomi popped her can open, the small hiss of carbonation loud in the quiet room. "You, on the other hand, you look like somebody who's had plenty of bad days and decided they were all the end of the world." Ren blinked. "That's oddly specific. I told you, I keep score." A small shrug. "Doesn't take a genius to read a room, Holloway. You came in here quiet on day 1 and got quieter every day since. People who talk about their bad days process them. People who don't just carry them. You always this direct. Only with people I think can handle it." Naomi took a long drink. "You gonna tell me what's actually going on? Or am I gonna have to guess? Because, fair warning, I'm annoyingly good at guessing." Ren looked at the logbook still open on her knees. For one long moment she almost closed it, almost tucked the whole thing back into the flannel shirt and said nothing, the way she'd said nothing for 12 years. The way saying nothing had always felt safer than saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, safer than handing someone a piece of herself they might not know how to hold carefully. Except something about the warm root beer and the blunt kindness, and the fact that nobody at Ashcombe had decided anything about her, yet made the words come easier than they ever had before, easier than they'd come in years. "My father died in a training accident," she said. 12 years ago. Report said pilot error. Naomi didn't say anything, just waited, which, Ren was starting to realize, might be the rarest and most valuable thing anyone had ever offered her. Rarer than sympathy, rarer than advice. "I don't think it was," Ren said. "And I think Commander Draven might have been there when it happened." The silence that followed had weight to it. "That's not a small thing to be carrying around," Naomi said finally. "No, you gonna do something about it." Ren looked down at the entry again. D overruled. "I don't know yet," she said. "Honestly, I don't even know what doing something about it would look like." Naomi nodded slowly, finished her root beer, set the empty can on the nightstand with a soft metallic click that somehow felt like punctuation, a small period. At the end of a sentence neither of them had fully finished yet. "Well," she said, standing. For what it's worth, whatever you decide, I'd rather fly wing with somebody carrying the truth than somebody carrying a lie they don't know is a lie. She paused at the door. For the record, your merge today wasn't bad. It was half a second late. Half a second isn't library energy. Half a second is just Thursday. Then she was gone, and Wren sat alone with the logbook and the dark window, and a name that finally had a face attached to it. The room quiet again in the particular way. Rooms go quiet after someone has said something true in them. The next 2 weeks did not get easier. Draven ran the class hard, harder than Wren had expected, even given the reputation. Stacking sorties back to back with debriefs that ran 3 hours for every hour flown. She struggled in ways she hadn't struggled since flight school. Got gunned twice more, though never as badly as that first Thursday. Each failure teaching her something slightly different about the margins she still needed to close. Watched Bishop preen through a debrief where he'd actually flown well for once, and made herself clap along with everyone else, because that was the kind of thing you did, even when your chest felt tight doing it, even when some small petty part of her wished the room had celebrated her instead. She watched Draven too, constantly, quietly, the way she watched everything. She noticed he never called on her first in academics anymore. Noticed he graded her tapes with a thoroughness that bordered on excessive, like he was looking for something in the footage, beyond just tactics, some pattern he half expected and half dreaded finding. Noticed, once, catching him staring at her across the flight line during a maintenance delay, an expression on his face she couldn't quite name, gone the instant he realized she'd caught him at it. Guilt, maybe, or grief. Sometimes those two wore the same face. She was learning. Sometimes you couldn't tell them apart from a distance, and sometimes, she suspected, you couldn't fully tell them apart even up close. She didn't approach him. Not yet. Because she needed more than a logbook entry and a hunch and a stranger's complicated face across a flight line. She needed something she could actually hold on to before she said a word out loud that couldn't be taken back, something solid enough to survive the moment it left her mouth. So she did what she'd always done. She worked. There was a retired chief named Osgood who ran the base library out of what used to be a supply shed. 3 rows of metal shelving and a coffee maker older than most of the pilots training there. The whole place smelling faintly of dust and old paper and machine oil that had probably never fully washed out of the concrete floor. Wren found him on a Sunday afternoon, the one day the schedule gave them any real freedom, going through boxes of decommissioned mishap reports that hadn't yet made it into digital archives. "You're the Holloway girl," he said. Not a question. Word traveled, apparently, even out here, in a base full of strangers who supposedly didn't know her yet. "Yes, Chief. Heard you're Daniel Holloway's kid." He said it plainly. No weight attached, which somehow made her chest tighten more than if he'd said it carefully, more than if he'd approached the name like something fragile. "Good stick. Flew with him twice, back when I was still turning wrenches out of Whitfield Point." Her heart did something complicated. "You knew him?" "Knew of him mostly. Everybody did." Osgood set down the box he was carrying, dust rising faintly in the shaft of afternoon light coming through the shed's single grimy window. He looked at her properly for the first time, the way older men sometimes look at younger people when they're deciding whether to treat them as adults or children, and something in his expression settled on adult. "You want to ask me something? I can see it on your face. Go ahead." She hesitated. Then, because Ray's voice was still somewhere in her head saying information, not verdicts, she asked it plain. "Do you know anything about the accident that killed him? Anything that wasn't in the official report?" Osgood was quiet a long moment, his hands going still on the box in front of him. "I know rumors," he said finally. "I know there were people who thought the weather call that day was wrong. I know it never went anywhere official, because rumors don't go anywhere official. They just sit in the back of a bar for a decade and slowly turn into something people stop repeating out loud." "What kind of rumors?" "That the flight lead pushed a profile he shouldn't have. That somebody higher up wanted the training window closed before a weather system rolled in. and somebody with rank made a call that a more careful pilot might not have made. He shrugged, though it wasn't a careless shrug. It was the shrug of a man who'd carried something a long time and didn't quite know where to set it down, a physical gesture that seemed to cost him more than it should have. I don't know if that's true. I wasn't there. I just turned wrenches and heard things secondhand at happy hour, same as everybody. Do you remember who was flight lead? Osgood looked at her for a long moment, something careful and almost sad in his expression. You already know the answer to that, he said quietly. Or you wouldn't be asking me the question with that face. She didn't say Draven's name out loud. Didn't need to. Osgood didn't say it either. But something passed between them, an understanding that didn't require the words, and when she left at the supply shed, 20 minutes later, she had nothing on paper. Nothing she could point to. Just one more voice confirming a shape she'd already started to see, a rumor stacked on top of a logbook entry, neither one enough on its own, but both of them together, starting to feel like something closer to certainty. Holloway, Osgood called after her. Just as she reached the door, she turned back. Whatever you decide to do with what you find out, he said, do it because it's right, not because it's satisfying. Those aren't always the same thing, and the difference matters more than people think it does. She nodded, though she didn't fully understand what he meant yet. She'd understand it better in a few weeks. She didn't know that yet either. The third week brought a scenario that changed everything. 2 versus 2, high aspect merge. Draven and Naomi flying as instructors this time, Ren paired with Bishop again. And for once, for the first time, all detachment Ren flew clean. Better than clean. She read the merge before it fully developed. Trusted the half-second she'd been missing that first Thursday, the one Draven had said, decided who got to keep doing this. Called the shot, took the shot, and heard the flattest, best 4 words she'd heard in 3 weeks. Guns. Holloway, good kill. Bishop, to his credit, whooped over the radio like it was his own win, genuine enthusiasm in his voice, with nothing competitive underneath it this time. Naomi's voice came through a beat later, dry as ever. Ledger's impressed. Ledger doesn't get impressed easy. Ren flew the RTB grinning behind her mask, alone in the cockpit, alone with something that felt, for the first time in weeks, uncomplicated, a clean, simple joy that had nothing tangled up underneath it. It didn't stay uncomplicated for long. Draven called her in after the debrief. Alone, not the group room this time. His office, small, government beige, a single window looking out over heat-shimmered tarmac, a desk with exactly the amount of clutter that suggested a man who worked hard but kept things organized. Folders stacked in neat piles, a mug of coffee gone cold beside a stapler. Sit, he said. She sat. He didn't sit right away. Stood by the window a moment, hands clasped behind his back, and something in his posture made her chest go tight before he'd said a single word. Some quality of stillness that felt less like calm, and more like a man bracing himself. That was good flying today, he said, finally. Thank you, sir. You fly like your father. The words landed harder than he probably meant them to. Or maybe exactly as hard as he meant them to. She couldn't tell yet, and that not knowing sat in her stomach like a stone. I didn't know him long enough to know how he flew, she said, careful, testing the ground before she put her full weight on it. Draven turned from the window, looked at her properly, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Ashcombe, she saw something in his face he hadn't bothered to file away, something raw and unguarded, the expression of a man too tired to keep holding the door shut. I did, he said quietly. The room went very still, sir, Ren said, and her voice, for the first time in 3 weeks of careful, level control, cracked slightly on the single syllable. Can I ask you something? He didn't answer right away, which was, in its own way, an answer. You can ask, he said finally. I can't promise I'll answer. She almost lost her nerve. Almost. 12 years of almost, of biting the question back down, every single time it climbed her throat, of deciding the timing was never quite right, and there was always a reason to wait one more day, one more week, one more year, the almost stretching itself into a habit so old it had started to feel like part of her personality instead of a choice she kept making. except she was done waiting. "Were you my father's flight lead?" she said. "The day of the accident." Something in Draven's face didn't just crack, it broke. He sat down slowly, like his knees had made the decision without consulting the rest of him, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. Just looked at a spot on the desk that clearly wasn't a spot on the desk. Was, more likely, somewhere 12 years in the past, a place he'd apparently never fully left, even while the rest of him kept moving forward through a career, a life, a room full of new trainees who had no idea what he was carrying. "Yes," he said, finally, barely above a whisper. Wren's hands folded in her lap went white-knuckled. "There was a weather system moving in," Draven said. Slow, careful, like a man diffusing something he'd been carrying so long it had started to feel permanently armed, every word placed with the caution of someone who understood exactly how much damage the wrong one could do. "Your father wanted to shift the profile, fly higher, wider, buy more margin against the front. I overruled him. Told him we'd finish the training window as scheduled. A breath, long, unsteady. I wanted to close it out before the weather grounded us for a week. I didn't want to explain a schedule slip to anyone above me." The office was silent, except for the distant hum of air conditioning, fighting a losing battle against the desert heat outside, and somewhere farther off, faint and muffled through the walls, the ordinary sound of the bass going on with its ordinary day, entirely unaware of what was happening in this one small room. "He followed the order," Draven said. "Because that's what you did. That's what good pilots did. And the front moved in faster than the forecast said it would, and visibility went to nothing at the worst possible altitude, and he stopped. Couldn't finish it. Didn't have to." Wren had read the accident report 100 times. She knew exactly how the sentence ended, had known it since she was 13, had simply never before had a name and a face and a voice to attach to the beginning of it. "The report said pilot error," she said. Quiet, not accusing, just stating the fact that had sat wrong in her chest for 12 years, laying it flat on the desk between them like something finally allowed out into the light. The report said what it needed to say to close the investigation quickly. Draven's voice had gone rough. "I let it say that. I didn't correct it. I told myself it was close enough to true he was flying the aircraft. After all, the decisions in the cockpit in those final seconds were his, and that letting it stand was easier for everyone, including his family, than dragging a command-level decision into the report and making it worse." "Easier for everyone," Wren repeated. "Flat, or easier for you?" Draven flinched like she'd struck him. "Both," he admitted. "I won't pretend it wasn't both." Wren sat there, feeling something enormous and complicated rearrange itself inside her chest. 12 years of grief that had never quite had a clean place to land, finally finding a shape. Not the shape she'd expected, not a villain exactly. Just a man, tired and older, who had made one bad call under pressure a long time ago, and then made a second bad call, quieter, slower, stretched across 12 years, choosing silence every single day he could have chosen otherwise. Every single one of those days, a decision he'd made all over again without her ever knowing there was a decision being made at all. "I've thought about your father every day for 12 years, Draven said. "I didn't know you existed until 3 weeks ago, when I saw your name on a roster and thought, surely not, surely that's a coincidence. And then you walked in the door and you had his eyes. And I have not slept a full night since." "That's not," Wren's voice caught. She swallowed. Tried again. "That's not something I know what to do with, sir." "I don't expect you to know what to do with it," Draven said. "I've had 12 years and I still don't know what to do with it myself." Silence stretched between them. Long, heavy. The kind of silence that changes the temperature of a room, that makes the air itself feel different once it finally breaks. "What happens now?" Wren said finally. Draven looked at her. Really looked. The way people look at something they've been avoiding looking at directly for a long time, like he was finally letting himself see the full shape of what he'd been carrying instead of just its outline. "That," he said quietly, "is entirely up to you. Fictional story. All characters, units, location, and events depicted are invented for entertainment purposes and do not represent real persons, military units, or historical operations. The quiet one they called Whisper Part 3. That's entirely up to you. The words followed her out of the office, down the hallway, across the tarmac, where the heat had started to soften into the long gold light of early evening, the kind of light that made even the ugliest government buildings on base look, for a few minutes, almost beautiful. She didn't remember walking back to the VOQ, just found herself there, suddenly, sitting on the edge of the thin mattress, with her hands flat on her knees, staring at a wall that offered no answers, no matter how long she stared at it, no matter how hard she wanted it to. Because that was the thing nobody warned you about. Getting the truth didn't feel like relief. Everybody always talked about the truth, like it was a door swinging open, like light was supposed to come pouring through the moment the hinge finally gave. Nobody mentioned that sometimes the truth was just a second grief, stacked directly on top of the first one, heavier for having waited 12 years to arrive, heavier because it came with a face and a voice and a man sitting 3 doors down the hallway who had to live with what he'd told her to. Her father hadn't made a mistake, except he had, technically, in the final seconds. The report wasn't entirely a lie. He'd been the one flying the aircraft when it happened, his hands on the controls when the visibility went to nothing and the numbers stopped being enough to save him. Except that wasn't the whole story either, which meant the story she'd been telling herself for 12 years. The story where the Navy had failed her father, had let a good, careful man take the blame for something that was never fully his to carry. That story was true too. Both of those things were true at the same time, sitting right on top of each other like 2 transparencies laid over the same photograph, and she didn't know yet how to look at the combined image without her whole chest hurting, without some part of her wanting to look away from it entirely. She didn't cry. She thought she might. Sat there waiting for it, the way you wait for a storm you can see building on the horizon, watching the color of the sky change and bracing for the first drop. It never came. Just a long, hollowed-out stillness, and underneath the stillness, something else. Something that felt unsettlingly close to anger. She sat with the anger for a while, turning it over the way she turned over everything, examining its edges. It wasn't clean. Anger at Draven for the decision. Anger at Draven for the silence after. Anger at the report for its convenient 2 words. Anger, underneath all of it, buried deepest and hardest to look at directly. At her father, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second at a time, before she made herself stop, for following the order at all, for not fighting harder, for leaving her with a folded flag and 11 minutes, and a version of events that had taken her 12 years to finally crack open. She hated that last part of the anger the most, hated that it existed at all. She sat with it anyway, because pretending it wasn't there had never once made anything smaller. It had only ever made things heavier, dragging along behind her unexamined, and she was too tired tonight to drag anything else. Naomi found her an hour later. Didn't knock this time, just opened the door a crack and looked in, the way you check on someone you already suspect is not okay. The door creaking faintly on a hinge that clearly hadn't been oiled since the Nixon administration. "You didn't come to chow," she said. "Wasn't hungry." "That's not an answer, Holloway." A pause. She came in anyway, closed the door behind her, and sat down on the room's single chair without being invited. The familiarity of it landing somewhere warm in Wren's chest, even through everything else she was feeling. "You look like somebody hit you with a truck. A slow truck. One of those big flatbed ones that takes its time about it." Wren almost laughed, came out more like an exhale. "I talked to Draven," she said. Naomi's face changed instantly. All the lightness went out of it, replaced by something careful, attentive, the joking posture dropping away like a coat she'd taken off the second she realized the room needed something else from her. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees and, "He was there," Wren said. "Flat. My father's accident. He was flight lead. He made a call my father disagreed with, and he let the official report say pilot error instead of ever correcting the record." Silence. Naomi didn't say anything right away, which Wren was starting to understand, was its own kind of gift. Not everyone knew how to sit inside somebody else's silence without trying to fill it, without rushing to smooth over the discomfort with words that didn't actually help. "How do you feel?" Naomi asked finally. "I don't know." Ren's voice cracked on the third word, small and involuntary, and she hated it. Hated that, after 12 years of careful control, it took exactly one honest sentence to undo it. One sentence in front of one person who had somehow, in 3 weeks, become someone she trusted enough to crack in front of. "I thought I'd feel like I'd won something, finally knowing. Instead, I just feel she stopped, because she didn't actually have the word for it yet, and reaching for one that wasn't quite right felt worse than just leaving the sentence open. Tired," she said finally. "I just feel tired." Naomi nodded slowly. "What are you gonna do?" "I don't know that either." "You could report it," Naomi said, carefully, testing the words before she fully committed to them, the way she tested most things, turning an idea over out loud, before deciding whether to stand behind it. "There's probably a process. Inspector General, formal complaint, something. You've got a name now, a location, a decision. That's more than most people ever get." "I know, but..." Ren looked at her hands. "But he spent 12 years carrying it," she said slowly, working it out loud, one word at a time, the way she'd worked out every hard thing in her life. On scratch paper, in a tactics room, at 400 when nobody else wanted to be there. "And I don't think destroying his career gives me my father back. I don't think it changes the report. I don't think it does anything except make 2 lives smaller instead of 1. "That's very generous of you," Naomi said, not unkindly, just honestly. "I'm not trying to be generous." Ren shook her head. "I'm trying to figure out what my father would have wanted. And I don't think he'd have wanted revenge. I think he'd have wanted the truth to exist somewhere. Just exist, without needing to burn a man down to prove it." Naomi was quiet a moment, studying her. "You're a better person than I am," she said finally. "I don't feel like a better person. I feel like somebody standing in the wreckage of something, trying to figure out which pieces are worth picking up." "That," Naomi said, "sounds like exactly what a better person feels like. Nobody who's actually a good person walks around feeling good about it. That's kind of the whole trick." Ren managed a small, tired smile at that. "When did you get so wise?" "Somewhere between my second and third root beer, probably." Naomi stood, stretched, the chair creaking under the shift of her weight. "You want company for a while, or you want to sit with this alone?" Ren considered it honestly. "Alone, I think," she said. "But thank you for asking instead of assuming. That's the whole secret to being a good friend," Naomi said, heading for the door. "Asking instead of assuming. Most people never figure that out." She paused, hand on the doorknob. "For what it's worth, Holloway, whatever you decide, I've got your back on it. Whichever way you go." "I know," Ren said, and found a little surprised that she meant it completely. Sleep didn't come easy that night, or the next. Ren flew the following day's sortie on autopilot, technically clean, technically fine, but something in her chest kept snagging on the memory of Draven's face, breaking open in that small beige office. Kept snagging on his voice, saying, "I have not slept a full night since." And the way that sentence had sounded less like an excuse and more like a confession, dragged out from somewhere very deep and very old. A wound that had never once been allowed to close properly, because he'd never once let anyone look at it. She didn't avoid him. Couldn't really. Not in a class of 6 with an instructor cadre of 4. But something had shifted between them. A careful new distance, neither of them named out loud. A distance that wasn't cold exactly. More like the careful space 2 people leave between themselves after a car accident, both still checking for damage. He didn't call on her first in academics anymore. Not out of avoidance now, but out of something that looked almost like respect. Like he was giving her room she hadn't asked for, but clearly needed. Room to exist in that classroom as just a trainee again, for an hour at a time, instead of as the daughter of a dead man he'd failed. She caught him watching her sometimes. Across the room, during lectures, his eyes finding her, and then quickly moving on when he realized she'd noticed. She didn't call him on it. There didn't seem to be a version of that conversation that would help either of them. On Thursday, He stopped her after the debrief. Just her. The room emptying out around them, chairs scraping, voices fading into the hallway, Bishop's laugh, carrying back from somewhere down the corridor as he recounted some story to Naomi that Wren couldn't quite catch the details of. Holloway. She turned. I meant what I said, Draven told her. Quiet. Careful. About it being up to you. Whatever you decide to do with what I told you. I won't fight it. I won't deny it. If you ask me to put it in writing. A pause. I should have said something 12 years ago. I've had 12 years to fix that, and I never did. And I don't get to pretend that's a small thing, just because I'm finally telling the truth now. Wren studied him, the gray in his hair, the tired lines around his eyes that she hadn't fully registered until she knew what put them there. A man who had carried something heavy for over a decade and had, in some strange way, been waiting the whole time for someone to finally ask him to set it down, though he'd never once had the courage to ask for that himself. I'm not going to report it, she said. Something in his shoulders dropped. Relief, maybe. Or something more complicated than relief. Something closer to the specific exhaustion of a man who has just been told a burden he expected to carry indefinitely might, after all, have an end date. I don't say that to let you off easy, she added quickly, because she needed him to understand the difference, needed the words to land exactly right, and not 1 inch softer than she meant them. I say it because my father wasn't a man who believed in burning things down to prove a point. He believed in doing the work, quietly, correctly, every single time, whether anyone was watching or not. Her voice wavered, steadied. I think the only way I can honor that is by doing the same thing. Not filing a report that turns this into a career-ending scandal for you. Just knowing, finally knowing, and flying the rest of this detachment the way he would have wanted me to fly it. Draven's jaw tightened. You're a better person than the Navy deserves, he said roughly. I'm not doing it for the Navy. Wren held his gaze. I'm doing it for him. He nodded slowly, something passing across his face that looked, for just a moment, like the particular relief of a man forgiven for something he'd stopped believing he'd ever be forgiven for. It didn't erase anything. She could see that in his eyes too, see that he understood forgiveness and absolution weren't the same thing, that she'd given him one and not necessarily the other. That seemed right to her. She wasn't sure she had the second one in her to give yet, maybe not ever. But the first one, at least, she could offer honestly. She called Ray that Sunday, told him everything, the logbook entry, Osgood in the supply shed, the office. Draven's face breaking open like something finally allowed to crack after 12 years under pressure, the whole story spilling out of her in a way that surprised even her. Sentences she'd been holding onto for days finally finding somewhere to land. Ray was quiet, a long time after she finished. Long enough that she checked her phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. You believe him? He asked finally. I do. That's a hard thing to believe. Man tells you he's the reason your daddy's dead. He's not the reason, Wren said slowly, working it out even as she said it, the same way she'd worked it out with Naomi 3 nights earlier, the thought getting a little clearer each time she said it out loud to someone who mattered. The weather's the reason. A bad call under pressure is the reason. 12 years of silence afterward is a different kind of reason, and I think that one's the one I'm actually angry about. You gonna stay angry? I don't know yet. Ray exhaled, long and slow, the kind of sound that carried Montana wind in it, even over a phone line 1,400 miles away. A sound she could picture perfectly, him standing on the porch with the phone pressed to his ear and his eyes on the fields. Your daddy used to say something, he said, about anger. Said it was like flying with a fuel leak. Doesn't ground you right away, but it changes everything about how you fly, and eventually it decides how far you get to go. Wren felt her eyes sting. First time in 3 weeks, that does sound like him. He'd have forgiven the man, Ray said. Quiet. Certain. Your daddy forgave everybody. Drove your mother crazy sometimes. But it never once made him weak, Birdie. It just meant he flew clean. No leak. How do you forgive somebody for something that big, though? Ray thought about that for a while before he answered. I don't think you do it all at once, he said finally. I think you do it the way you do anything hard. a little at a time. Some days you'll do it better than others. Some days you'll wake up angry all over again like it's brand new. That's fine. That's just how it works. The trick isn't never being angry. The trick is not letting the anger fly the plane. She thought about that for a long moment. That's a good way to put it. I had a good teacher, Ray said, and she could hear the small smile in his voice even without seeing it. Who? Your daddy, obviously. Who else? A pause, warmer this time. You coming home when this is done? Your mother's been asking. I was planning on it. Take some leave. Good. That old airstrip's been asking about you, too. She laughed. A real one this time. Something loosening in her chest for the first time in days. The airstrip doesn't ask about anything, Ray. It's a strip of dirt with a windsock. Don't let it hear you say that, he said. It's sensitive. She sat with that for a long time after they hung up. Fly clean. No leak. Somewhere in the pit of her chest, something that had been clenched tight since that office conversation began, slowly, carefully, started to loosen. Not all at once. Ray had told her it wouldn't happen all at once, and she was starting to believe him. But enough that she slept better that night than she had in the 4 nights before it. The final 2 weeks of the detachment moved differently than the first 4 had. Not easier. Ashcombe never got easier. But something in Wren had settled, some low steady hum underneath everything else. The particular calm of a person who has finally stopped carrying a question and started carrying an answer instead, even an answer that hurt, even an answer with rough edges she hadn't fully sanded down yet. She flew better. Not because the anger was gone. Ray was right. That kind of thing didn't just vanish. It just stopped leaking fuel everywhere. But because she wasn't spending half her attention anymore wondering about Draven's face in the front of the room. She knew now. Knowing, it turned out, took up far less room in her head than not knowing ever had, freeing up something in her that she hadn't even realized had been occupied. Naomi noticed the shift before anyone else did. You're different, she said one evening, the two of them sitting on the tailgate of a maintenance truck watching the sun go down, orange and enormous, behind the distant mountains. The sky doing the particular slow burn it only seemed to do out here in the open desert. No buildings tall enough anywhere to interrupt the view. Different how? Quieter. If that's even possible for you. Naomi bumped her shoulder against Wren's. But it's a different quiet. Before it was like you were bracing for something. Now it's like you already got hit and you're just standing back up. Wren considered that. That's about right, she admitted. You gonna tell me the rest of it someday? Someday, Wren said. Not today. Fair. Naomi tipped her head back, closed her eyes against the last of the sun, the light catching the scar through her eyebrow and turning it gold for a second. For what it's worth, whatever's going on with you, it's making you fly like somebody who's got nothing left to prove. Which is terrifying, by the way, for the rest of us. Good, Wren said, and meant it, for the first time in a long time, the word coming out with a small, satisfied edge she hadn't heard in her own voice in weeks. You know, Naomi added, after a moment, when I first met you, I thought you were the kind of quiet that was hiding something small, like insecurity, or homesickness, or something normal like that. And now I think you were hiding something enormous the whole time. Something most people would have talked about constantly, if they had it. You just carried it instead. Naomi shook her head slowly. I don't know if that's the healthiest way to live, but I respect the hell out of it. It's not probably, Wren said, the healthiest way. No offense, but you don't seem like the type who's ever prioritized healthy over functional. Wren laughed, surprised. That's uncomfortably accurate. I told you. I keep score. Naomi grinned, the expression easy in the fading light. I'm working on a new one for you, by the way. A better nickname than Ledger's giving you in my head right now. Do I want to know? Absolutely not. Not yet. Bishop struggled in those final weeks in ways he hadn't expected to. His aggression, the thing that had carried him through the first month, started working against him. Once, the scenarios got complicated enough to punish overconfidence. It left the instructor cadre deliberately building traps into the later exercises, specific designed to catch pilots who hadn't yet learned when patience mattered more than commitment. Ren watched him get taken apart in a debrief, the way she'd been taken apart that first Thursday. Watched his jaw tighten. Watched him start to understand, maybe for the first time in his career, what it felt like to sit in a chair and have your worst half-second projected on a screen in front of everyone. She found him afterward, alone, staring at nothing near the flight line, the heat of the day finally starting to ease into evening. "You good?" she asked. He looked up, surprised, like he hadn't expected her of all people to check on him. "Not really," he admitted. "Welcome to the club," Ren said. Not unkindly. He almost laughed. Almost. "You gonna tell me it gets easier?" "No," she said honestly. "I'm gonna tell you it gets more useful." Different thing. Bishop studied her for a moment, something recalibrating behind his eyes. The easy confidence he usually wore replaced, for once, with something more genuinely curious. "You've changed since week 1, he said. "Everybody has." "No," he said. "I mean you specifically. You used to look like you were waiting for the room to turn on you. Now you look like he searched for the word. Like you already survived the worst thing the room could do." Ren didn't answer right away. Because he wasn't entirely wrong, and she wasn't sure yet how to explain a truth that big to a man she'd barely spoken 20 words to in a month. A man who 3 weeks ago had been the one making her feel small in front of a debrief room, though the memory of that felt strangely distant now, like something that had happened to a different, earlier version of both of them. "Something like that," she said finally. "You want to talk about it?" "Not really. But thank you for asking." Bishop nodded, accepting that easily, no offense in it. "Fair enough." He glanced toward the flight line, where the day's last sortie was taxiing back in, canopy catching the low orange light. "For what it's worth, I owe you an apology too. Not just the library thing back at Whitfield Point. I've been kind of a jerk this whole detachment, trying to prove I belonged here. You do belong here." "Yeah, well, wish I'd figured that out without needing 6 weeks of getting my ego handed to me on a screen in front of everybody." "Nobody figures it out the easy way," Ren said. "I don't think there is an easy way. That's grim. That's honest." He huffed a small laugh at that, something loosening in his shoulders. "Fair enough, Holloway, fair enough." The final evaluation loomed the way final evaluations always loom. A single sortie, a single scenario, a single tape that would follow every pilot in that room for the rest of their careers. Whether they wanted it to or not, the entire weight of 6 weeks, compressed down into one afternoon that would decide, in the eyes of the Navy at least, whether all of it had meant anything. Draven briefed it himself. Higher spec, multi-bogey, the kind of scenario built specifically to expose whatever weakness 6 weeks of training hadn't managed to sand down. The last and hardest test the program had to offer. Ren sat in the front row this time, not the back. She'd noticed herself moving forward, seat by seat, over the last 2 weeks, without ever quite deciding to do it consciously. Just one more thing that had shifted without her fully realizing, until she looked up one day and found herself 3 rows closer to the whiteboard than she'd started. Close enough now that she could see every small detail of Draven's expression as he walked the class through the scenario parameters. Draven's eyes found hers, briefly, during the brief. Something passed between them. Not quite a smile. Something steadier than that. Something that felt, in its own quiet way, like an acknowledgement of everything that had happened between them in 6 weeks, without either of them needing to name a single piece of it out loud. "Good luck," he said, to the room. But she felt it land somewhere more specific than that, somewhere aimed directly at her, even though his eyes had already moved on to the next trainee. The night before the evaluation, she'd sat in her room with the logbook open one more time, not looking for anything new this time, just wanting the familiar weight of it in her hands, the familiar cadence of her father's handwriting. She'd found herself, without quite planning to, writing a short entry of her own in the back pages, the ones he'd never filled, in her own hand, careful and small the way his had gotten near the end. Final evaluation tomorrow, she'd written. "I know now what I didn't know 6 weeks ago. I don't know yet what to do with all of it, but I know I'm flying it the way you taught me. Feel it. Don't just calculate it. She'd closed the book after that. Slept better than she expected to. The sortie itself unfolded like something out of her father's old logbook entries, the ones written in the cramped, careful hand of a man trying to fit truth into limited space. 2 aggressors. High closure. A merge that developed faster and dirtier than the brief had suggested it would, because that was the whole point of a final evaluation. To throw exactly the kind of chaos at a pilot that the syllabus couldn't fully prepare her for, the kind of chaos that only ever showed up once, in the moment that actually counted. Wren felt the half-second arrive before it fully happened. The one Draven had told her, that first devastating Thursday, decided who got to keep doing this. She felt it building in the geometry, felt her father's voice somewhere underneath her own thoughts saying, "You don't calculate it, you feel it." And for the first time in her career, the feeling and the calculation arrived at exactly the same moment, together, seamless, no lag between the two of them at all. She took the shot. Clean. Early. Exactly on the numbers her father used to draw on a kitchen table napkin in Cedar Hollow. Numbers that had once just been geometry and were now something closer to inheritance. Something that lived in her hands as much as her head. Guns. The radio crackled. Naomi's voice this time, flying as the second aggressor, sounding almost proud, despite the circumstances, a small warmth slipping through the professional flatness of the radio call. Good kill, Holloway. Clean merge, clean shot. But the scenario wasn't finished. A second bogey rolled in from a different vector, and Wren felt the old fear try to climb up her throat, the fear that had cost her that first Thursday. The fear of trusting her own read over the numbers on the panel. The old doubt whispering that maybe the first kill had been luck. Maybe this one would be the one that proved it. Except this time, she didn't let it. Because her father's voice was louder than the fear now. Because the last 3 weeks had taught her that the half-second mattered more than the caution. That the whole difference between winning and losing lived inside a window so small. Most people never learned to see it at all. And she had learned to see it, finally, the hard way, the only way that ever actually worked. She flew the second engagement clean, too. By the time she brought the aircraft back around for landing, her flight suit was soaked through. Her hands were shaking slightly on the controls in that particular post-adrenaline way, and something in her chest felt enormous and unfamiliar. Not relief exactly, something closer to arrival. She sat in the cockpit for a long moment after shutdown, engine ticking as it cooled, the desert heat pressing in through the open canopy, and let herself feel the whole shape of it. 6 weeks, 12 years, a father's handwriting, and a stranger's confession, and a friend's warm root beer, and an old chief's careful advice, all of it somehow arriving, together, in this one long moment, sitting alone in a cockpit on a runway in the middle of Nevada. She climbed down the ladder on legs that felt slightly unsteady, and didn't mind that they did. The debrief room was, for once, not a place of quiet dread. Draven ran her tape frame by frame, the same way he'd run it that first devastating Thursday. Except this time the room watched something different unfold on the screen. A merge decided cleanly. A read trusted at exactly the right instant. A second engagement handled with the kind of composure instructors usually only saw from pilots 5 years further into their careers. He paused the tape at the final frame, looked at the room, then longer at Wren. "This," he said slowly, "is the cleanest defensive to offensive transition I have seen from a trainee in this program in 6 years." A pause. "I'm going to request permission to use this tape in next cycle's syllabus." The room was silent. Bishop, to his credit, was the first to speak. "Well deserved," he said, and meant it, this time. No twitch of satisfaction at anyone else's expense anywhere near his face. The words coming out with a warmth that surprised even him, if the small, almost sheepish smile that followed was any indication. Naomi caught Wren's eye across the room and gave the smallest, driest nod imaginable. High praise coming from her. Wren understood that by now. Understood the whole language of small gestures Naomi used, instead of the big ones other people relied on. The other 3 trainees added their own quieter congratulations. A round of nods and murmured well-dones that felt, after 6 weeks together, more sincere than loud applause would have been. Draven closed the laptop. "Holloway," he said. "Stay a minute after the room clears." When it was just the two of them again, the small beige office, holding the same tired afternoon light it had held 3 weeks earlier, Draven stood by the window, with his hands clasped behind his back, the same posture he'd held the day everything cracked open between them. "You flew like him today," he said. "Quiet, I know," Ren said. "I felt it." Draven turned. Something in his face had eased, some weight finally allowed to shift after 12 years of carrying it alone. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "For what you decided. For not." He stopped. Started again, for choosing to let this be something other than a court case. "I didn't do it for you," Ren reminded him. Gently this time. Not sharp the way she'd said it the first time. "I know," Draven said. "I know exactly who you did it for. That's the part that humbles me most." Ren looked at him for a long moment. "There's one thing I want," she said. "Name it when it's time. Whatever ceremony you do at the end of this. Call signs, whatever the tradition is here." She took a breath. "I want you to tell the room about him. My father. Not the accident. Just who he was. I think this program should know the kind of pilot it almost lost 12 years ago. And I think I want to hear somebody besides me say his name out loud, in a room full of people who never got the chance to know him." Draven's throat worked visibly. "I can do that," he said, roughly. "I owe you a great deal more than that. But I can do that." "That's all I want," Ren said. "That's enough." He studied her a moment, something almost wondering in his expression. "After everything?" "I'm sure," Ren said. "It's not about letting you off easy, Commander. I told you that already. It's about making sure the truth exists somewhere besides a logbook entry only I've ever read. That's not mercy. That's just finishing the story properly." Draven nodded slowly, and for a moment neither of them said anything else. The office quiet, except for the distant sound of the bass outside, still going about its ordinary evening, entirely unaware of the two people inside this small room, finally reaching the end of something that had taken 12 years to get here. The final night of the Advanced Tactics Detachment arrived the way final nights always arrive. Too fast and too slow at once. 6 weeks compressed suddenly into something that felt like it had happened both yesterday and a lifetime ago. The strange elastic quality of time that only ever showed up at endings. The ready room had been rearranged. Chairs in a loose half-circle instead of straight rows. Someone had strung a string of cheap lights across the ceiling, the kind you'd find at a hardware store, and somehow they made the whole cold institutional room feel almost warm. The harsh fluorescence switched off in favor of the softer glow, shadows pooling gently in the corners instead of the usual sterile brightness. A cooler sat near the door, stocked with drinks nobody had officially approved, but nobody was going to question tonight. Someone had brought a speaker, music playing low enough to talk over. The 6 trainees and 4 instructors mingling in a way that felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, less like a hierarchy and more like a group of people who had genuinely earned each other's respect. Tradition at Ashcombe held that the instructor cadre named call signs on the final night, in front of the whole class, and that the naming wasn't something you campaigned for. It was something people watched you earn over 6 brutal weeks and then arrived at together. Draven stood at the front with a marker in his hand. He went through the others first, ribbed Bishop about a scenario in week 2 where he'd chased a shot so hard he'd nearly run himself out of fuel, and the room laughed, and Bishop laughed loudest of anyone, because that was the kind of story that only stung a little once you'd survived the whole 6 weeks. Wrote a name on the board that made Bishop groan and cover his face while everyone else applauded. He named Naomi, something that made her roll her eyes and mutter obviously under her breath, though the small smile she couldn't quite hide said she didn't mind it nearly as much as she pretended to. The rest of the trainees got their own names, each one earning its own small round of laughter or applause. 6 weeks of shared struggle compressed into a single word for each of them, a word that would follow them for the rest of their careers. Then he got to Ren. The room went quiet in a different way. not the amused anticipation from before. Something more like genuine curiosity, because nobody in that class had a funny story about her. She hadn't given them one. Not once in 6 weeks had she handed anyone a moment to tease. Draven set the marker down on the ledge beneath the whiteboard. Didn't pick it back up right away. "I've been running this detachment for 11 years, he said. His voice, usually so level, carried an unfamiliar rasp. "I've named a lot of call signs in that time. Most of them are jokes. Good ones sometimes. But jokes." He paused. "This one isn't going to be." The room shifted, sat up straighter, sensing something different in the air. The music somebody had left playing low in the background, fading out entirely, as someone near the speaker quietly reached over and turned it off. 12 years ago, Draven said, I flew with a commander named Daniel Holloway. Best stick I ever shared a ready room with. Careful. Exact. The kind of pilot who never once let his own confidence talk him out of double-checking something that mattered. A breath, unsteady. He died in a training accident that I have carried every single day since, more heavily than I have ever told another living soul. Because I made a call that day I shouldn't have made. And I let the official record simplify what happened into something smaller and easier than the truth. The silence in that room had a weight nobody there would ever forget. 3 weeks into this cycle, Draven continued, I found out his daughter was sitting in my classroom. And instead of running from that, the way I'd been running from it for 12 years, she gave me the chance to finally say it out loud. He looked directly at Ren. She didn't destroy me for it. She could have. She had every right to. Instead, she chose to let this be about who her father was, instead of about what happened to him. He picked the marker back up. I watched her fly emerge 2 days ago, he said, using geometry. Her father used to sketch on napkins at a kitchen table in Montana, and for about 4 seconds, I could have sworn I was flying wing with him again. His hand, for once, was not entirely steady on the whiteboard. She never raised her voice once in 6 weeks, Draven said. Never once asked anyone in this room to believe in her before she'd already done the work. Never told a single one of you what she was carrying, because she didn't need an audience for it to be true. He wrote the word. No flourish. No dramatic pause for effect. Just steady letters on a whiteboard that had seen 11 years of names come and go. Whisper, nobody laughed the way people usually laugh at a new call sign. The room sat in a silence with real weight behind it, the particular silence of people realizing, all at once, that they had spent 6 weeks in a room with someone remarkable and hadn't fully understood it until the moment it was finally named out loud. Bishop was the first to break it, standing slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and started clapping, slow and deliberate at first, the sound of it filling the quiet room like something physical. Naomi joined a beat later, and then the rest of the trainees, and then quietly, the other 3 instructors, until the whole room was on its feet, applauding in a way that had nothing performative in it at all, nothing but genuine, earned respect. Ren sat with her hands folded in her lap, the same posture she'd carried into every ready room since Whitfield Point, and felt her eyes finally sting. 12 years of held-back tears finally finding an opening. And let them. Thank you, sir, she said, when the room quieted enough for her to be heard, because that was the honest and complete extent of what needed saying, though. Everyone in that room understood it, carried a great deal more weight than 4 small words usually could. The party wound down slowly after that, the way parties do, when something significant has happened in the middle of them, people lingering a little longer than they might otherwise. Conversations quieter and more sincere than the earlier joking had been. Naomi found her near the door, both of them slipping out into the cool desert evening for a moment of air. Whisper, Naomi said, testing the word. It fits. I said that to you before, back on day 1, sort of. Didn't know how right I was. You did say that, Ren said, remembering. The first night. About people who talk about their bad days versus people who carry them. I was closer to the truth than I knew. Naomi bumped her shoulder against Ren's, the way she'd done that first Thursday night with the warm root beer. You gonna keep flying with people who deserve to know you? Actually know you, I mean. Not just the parts you let people see. Ren considered that. I'd like to, she said, I'm not sure I know how, exactly. It's not really how I've operated. Practice, Naomi said. Same as everything else. You're good at practicing things nobody else wants to bother with. This is just one more thing to add to the list. That's annoyingly good advice. I keep score, Naomi said, grinning. Turns out I also give decent advice sometimes. Who knew? They stood together a while longer, looking out at the dark desert, stretching flat toward the mountains, stars beginning to prick through the deepening sky in numbers that Wren had almost forgotten a sky could hold, the kind of star-thick darkness that only ever showed up somewhere, far enough from cities to remember what real night looked like. You keep in touch, Naomi said finally. Not quite a question, I will, Wren said. I promise. Good, because Ledger doesn't make friends easy. If I decide you're one, you're stuck with me. I can live with that. She flew back into Whitfield Point 2 days later. Same sea bag over her shoulder. Same road-worn truck, waiting in long-term parking. Though somehow both felt lighter than they had 6 weeks earlier. Nobody had told the squadron officially what happened on that final night. But word travels through naval aviation, faster than anybody ever expects it to, and by the time she walked back into Ironclad's ready room, half the squadron already knew. This time when she walked in, people looked up. Boyle stood first. Actually stood, chair scraping back loud enough to turn heads. Whisper, huh? He said. Not quite an apology, but clearly, unmistakably, meant as one. Riddle pulled out the chair beside on her own, without a word, patted the seat once. Stonewall nodded from across the room, worth more in that particular language than most people's entire speeches put together. Dana, catching sight of her from the doorway, actually squealed, loud enough that half the room turned to look, and crossed the room to hug her before Wren had even fully set her bag down. I heard, Dana said into her shoulder. I heard, and I told everybody I called it, even though I definitely did not call it. Wren laughed, the sound coming easier than it had in weeks. You did not call it? No, Dana admitted, pulling back. But I'm claiming it anyway. Best roommate privileges. Wren set her bag down, sat where she was offered, let the conversation fill in around her the way it never quite had before. The room hadn't changed its walls or its whiteboard, but it had become, in every way that mattered, a different room entirely. Corrigan called her into his office that same afternoon, not for a reprimand, for something closer to a quiet acknowledgement, the kind senior officers rarely bothered giving junior pilots, but somehow, in her case, made an exception for. Heard good things, he said. Simple, direct. Thank you, sir. Your father would have been proud. He said it plainly, the way Osgood had said it in the supply shed weeks earlier, no weight attached beyond the truth of it. I only met him once at a conference years back. Quiet man, sharp as anything I ever saw. Wren felt something warm settle behind her ribs. I've heard that a few times now, she said, about the quiet part. Seems to run in the family. Corrigan almost smiled. Almost. Get some rest, Holloway. You earned it, sir, Wren said before he could turn back to his paperwork. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Did you know? About my father and Commander Draven and the accident. Corrigan's expression didn't change much, but something careful entered it. I heard rumors, same as everyone from that era, he said. Never anything I could confirm. Never anything official. A pause. I'm glad you got your answer, Holloway. However you got it. Even though it wasn't the answer I expected. Especially because of that, Corrigan said. The answers you expect rarely teach you anything. It's the ones you don't that actually change something. She thought about that the whole walk back to her room. Thought her father might have said something very similar if he'd ever had the chance. She took leave the following month. Drove the 1,400 miles back to Cedar Hollow with the windows down and the radio off most of the way, letting the wide brown country roll past the way it always did, mile after mile of nothing that somehow felt like everything once you'd been away long enough. She stopped once, outside Barstow, at the same gas station where her truck's air conditioning had first given up 6 months earlier on the drive out, bought a bad cup of coffee, stood outside for a minute in the heat, looking back the way she'd come, then forward, toward home, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't quite had words for in a long time. Ray was waiting on the porch when she pulled up the gravel drive. Older than she remembered, though it had only been 8 months. Silver, coming in heavier at his temples. He didn't say anything at first. Just came down off the porch steps and pulled her into a hug that smelled like engine grease and cut wheat, the same way it always had, the same way it probably always would. "Heard you got a call sign," he said finally. Voice rough. "Whisper," she said. Ray pulled back, studied her face for a long moment, the way he used to study weather coming in over the flats, reading something in it that took him a lifetime to learn how to read. "Fitz," he said simply. Her mother came out onto the porch a moment later, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and the hug she gave Wren lasted even longer than Ray's had, neither of them saying much of anything for a full minute, just standing together in the gravel drive with the Montana evening settling gold and quiet around them. "You look different," her mother said finally, pulling back to study her. "Good different or bad different?" "Good, lighter, somehow. Like you set something down." Wren thought about that. "I think I did," she said. "Or started to, anyway." Her mother didn't press for details, not yet. Just nodded, the way she always had, the same quiet acceptance Wren had inherited without ever quite realizing where it came from. "Dinner's almost ready," her mother said instead. "Your favorite. Come inside before it gets cold." That evening, after dinner, after her mother had gone to bed, and the house had settled into the particular stillness it only found late at night, Wren told Ray everything. All of it. The logbook entry. Osgood. Draven's office. The confession that had broken something open in her chest that she hadn't fully finished putting back together. Ray listened the whole way through without interrupting, the porch swing creaking softly under them, the night full of the particular sound of Montana crickets and distant wind moving through wheat that never quite went silent, even after dark. When she finished, he was quiet a long time. "You did right," he said finally. "I don't know if I did," Wren admitted. "Part of me still wonders if I should have reported it, made it official, made somebody pay for it. Somebody already paid for it," Ray said. 12 years of not sleeping. That man's been paying for it, the whole time you were growing up not knowing his name. He shook his head slowly. "Doesn't mean what he did was right. Doesn't mean you owed him forgiveness. But you gave it anyway. And I don't think that makes you soft, Birdie. I think that makes you exactly like your daddy." Wren felt her eyes sting again, the second time in as many weeks. Something that had been locked tight for 12 years. Finally, slowly, learning how to open. "I miss him," she said, quietly. The first time she'd said it out loud in years, rather than just carrying it silently the way she carried everything. "I know you do," Ray said. "I do too. Every single day." He reached over, squeezed her hand once, the way he'd done 100 times since she was 8 years old in that jump seat. "But you're flying his airplane now, in a manner of speaking. Not the actual metal. The way he flew it. Careful. Exact. Never asking anybody to believe in you before you'd already earned it." He looked at her sideways. "That's not nothing, Birdie. That's about as good a way as anybody's ever found to keep somebody alive after they're gone." They drove out to the old airstrip that evening, the one at the edge of the cotton and wheat fields, weathered windsock hanging limp in the still evening air, the same strip her father used to fly out of, before the Navy took him somewhere bigger and, eventually, somewhere final. Wren stood near the old tie-down for a long time. Didn't say much. Ray had always understood that about her. Didn't push, just stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, watching the sky go orange and then violet, and then that deep, enormous blue that only ever showed up over open country. "Your daddy used to stand right there," Ray said eventually. Quiet. Same spot. Same look on his face. What look? Like he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. Wren felt her throat tighten. "I think I finally understand what he was listening to," she said. Ray didn't ask her to explain, just nodded, the way he'd always nodded at the things that didn't need explaining, and put a hand flat against the old fence rail, like he was greeting an old friend who'd taught him something he'd never had to be told twice. Wren put her hand next to his. The wind moved soft through the wheat behind them, the same wind that had taught her, at 8 years old, how to feel a gust before it ever reached the stick. Somewhere above, faint and distant, a pair of birds cut across the darkening sky in a formation so clean it looked deliberate. She watched them until they disappeared past the tree line. "You gonna keep flying?" Ray asked after a while. "After all this? After everything you found out?" "Yes," Ren said. No hesitation in it at all. "More than ever, actually." "Good," Ray said. He'd have wanted that. More than the apology. More than the truth, even. He'd have wanted you up there. They stood together a while longer, the last light fading fully out of the sky, the first stars beginning to show, faint and then brighter as the darkness deepened around them. "Thank you," Ren said finally, "for always answering the phone on Thursdays, for 14 years of Sunday calls, for never once telling me to let it go, even when I probably should have, some days." Ray's arm came around her shoulders, warm and familiar. "That's what family's for, Birdie," he said. "Somebody's got to keep the line open. Might as well be me. Nobody out here wore a name tape. Nobody here had ever laughed at her for being quiet. It was, in its own way, the first ready room she'd ever sat in, and the first place that had ever taught her the only lesson that mattered, the one that had carried her through every silent room and every doubting glance in the years since, that the sky never cared how loud you walked into it. It only cared whether you were paying attention the whole time everyone else wasn't. And somewhere out past the old windsock, past the fence line, past 12 years of quiet grief finally allowed to rest, Ren Holloway stood very still in the place that made her, listening, the way her father taught her to, the way she always would.